Well, hello everyone, and I'm Sue Gander. I'm with the Electrification Coalition. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our Nevada EV Policy Bootcamp. Hope you are having fun jamming out to a little bit of our tunes there. We're looking forward to a really exciting day, spending it with you, talking about our favorite topic, which is the electrification of Nevada's transportation future. This is one of 5 boot camps that we've been holding virtually, but across the country. So we're really excited to be with you today. This one is designed specifically for Nevada, for Nevadans, with Nevadans. And we really appreciate all the help of many of the folks that are going to be with us today in making this a really successful event. I do want to start by recognizing that we are all continuing to go through some very challenging times now. We're doing this meeting virtually. And we know that we are all struggling with an assortment of new challenges that have been brought on by the pandemic. Recognize that Nevada has been, particularly hard hit, both in terms of its citizens and its economy. And not only that, we've all seen the impact on the auto industry more broadly as we've moved through some of these challenging times. It is heartening, however, to note that the electric vehicle industry continues to be strong, and the auto industry commitment to electric vehicles has actually even heightened in these past few months. And we'll be hearing much more about that as we move forward, and about a whole variety of topics, all about how we can help move Nevada forward and accelerate its transition to electric vehicles. So just a little bit about the boot camp and kind of what to expect. We'll be spending the next few hours hearing from a whole variety of folks about how we can accelerate Nevada's electrified transportation future. We use this term boot camp. We do have an admiral with us today, but I promise there are no push-ups, there are no burpees. We do hope to exercise your brains and get you in good shape for a lot of work that's coming ahead in 2021. We also do encourage you to get up and move around, as you need to. It's a lot to be sitting in front of a screen. So, feel free to jump up and do your own version of whatever you need to kind of keep the blood flowing there. I'm going to speak to a few important housekeeping tips from the get-go. First of all, welcome to the many, many dozens of folks that have joined us today. Fortunately, we can't go around and do introductions, but please do introduce yourself by signing in to our chat box, first and last name, organization, just so everyone knows kind of who's in the room, if you will. I also want to know that we are recording this boot camp. We will share that later, as well as the slides that you'll be seeing later as well. So you'll get a chance to look through those. We've linked all of the speaker bios into the agenda, and we'll send that through the chat. So we won't be doing large introductions of folks, but please do check out their biographies and get a chance to know their backgrounds as well. We will be using the chat box, and there's also I think a Q&A box for questions throughout the session. So feel free to please put those in. We have some sessions where we will have time for Q&A, and then we will also have a discussion only session during what is known as our fishbowl. And we'll talk about that a little bit later today, where you'll get a chance to be part of the show yourself. So we'll talk more about that, but if you already are excited about being part of that and you want to jump in and be part of that discussion, please go ahead and chat privately. So not to everyone, but just directly to EC Tech, and Annie, who is the person behind that. We'll get you in the queue for the fishbowl. We'll have a few folks kicking it off, but we want to work in as many folks as we can. And then finally, we will be sending out a survey after the boot camp. We really appreciate your feedback. We want to hear what worked, what resonated with you, anything else that we can do better for the next time. So please do give us your feedback on that post-meeting survey. And as you see there, we've got our hashtag, our Twitter feed. We do appreciate any amplification. This is not for direct attribution, but please do go ahead and let folks know that you're having a great time and learning good stuff here at our boot camp. We'll be sending things out as well. All right. So I mentioned we'll be having a lot of experts with us today. This is just a showing of who those folks are. It's an amazing array of folks, a lot of Nevada-based experts that have been working on these issues, some quote outsiders as well that we thought would be helpful to bring to the table. We're really excited and really grateful for their time and their attention on this, and they really span a whole variety of perspectives and interests, and really looking forward to hearing more from each of them. So we can't do, a full welcome and introductions. We do want to get to know you and kind of get to know a little bit more about you and where you're coming from. So we had this poll that was up at the beginning of the session, just to kind of get a sense of who's out there in the audience. So I'm just going to take a look at those and share with you all the results there. First of all, we wanted to appreciate, where are we coming from on this topic? So how long have you been part of efforts to advance EVs in Nevada? And it looks like it's a nice spread, bunch of folks who, maybe not so long. This is kind of a new thing for them. So hopefully this will be a helpful addition to your knowledge base. And then got a mix of folks with 1 to 2, 3 to 4, and more than 5 years. We'll definitely have something for everyone. Great to see a good mix of folks there. Then we asked, when do you expect to purchase your first electric vehicle? And very excited to see that over a third of you already have one. I think that might be a record for these 5 states. I'll have to go back and look. Don't quote me on that, but I think Nevada might have topped the charts of the 5 states we're working with. And then others are planning in the next couple of years. Some folks are like never or don't know yet. That's fair. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better sense of that. And hopefully it's, assuming you drive, we'll put that out there, and that you plan to own a vehicle, that it's in the near term. Lots of great models coming out, as you'll hear more and more in the coming years. So third one is, if you have purchased or plan to purchase an EV, what would be your top 2 motivations? And looks like the leader by far, and you could answer more than one, I think, is clean air, protecting the environment, critical issue. We know that Nevada's really put clean air and environmental protection front and center. We'll be hearing more about that later today from our panel of state experts. But also importantly, reducing our country's dependency on oil. That's at the heart of the mission for the Electrification Coalition. You'll be hearing about that later as well. Saving money, of course, great performance, being a trendsetter. Appreciate the three trendsetters there out of the group. So thank you very much. Hopefully you get a chance to get a sense of who's joining you today. And we appreciate your answering that poll just to have us get to know you a little bit better. We're gonna return the favor and let you know a little bit more about the Electrification Coalition. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We are committed to promoting policies and programs that facilitate the deployment of electric vehicles at a mass scale to combat the economic and national security dangers caused by our dependence on oil. So basically, we're doing EVs to help secure and improve the security of the country. We're going to hear quite a bit about that as we move forward. Just putting a little additional data behind that, 91%. So large proportion of the U.S. transportation sector is powered by oil. And notably, transportation is Nevada's largest greenhouse gas emitting sector. So knowing that that's a really key concern for Nevada, it just shows the importance and the value that electrification can bring to the state. So I mentioned a little bit about the Electrification Coalition, and I wanted to share how we actually accomplished this mission of bringing EVs to scale. And it really is one vehicle, one fleet, one city, one state at a time. We've been at this for over a decade, and so have really proven out kind of how do we get to the wins. And this shows a little bit about our history. We've been working at the local level, implementing things like the Climate Mayors EV Purchasing Collaborative, where we've had over 200 mayors across the country adding EVs to their fleets. That includes Reno, Nevada, as a part of that program. We've been doing accelerator programs like the ones we've hosted in Northern Colorado, in Rochester, New York, in Orlando, in Columbus, Ohio, just proving out how a community coming together and focusing on EV adoption can really move things forward. And to prove that that actually can make a difference, in Rochester, New York, through the program that we implemented, we were able to triple the average EV adoption rate. So this really can happen, and it can happen at scale. We recently launched a freight electrification pilot. We're really excited about that. We have a partnership with Nestle where we're going to be working in Ohio, and more to come on that. But we know the medium and heavy duty sector are a growing interest and a growing opportunity. And then last but not least is our state EV policy accelerator program. I'm going to speak to that in a minute, but we added that to our suite of programs, really in recognition of the important role that state policy making plays in advancing electrification alongside local as well as federal policy. So we're excited to be working with Nevada as part of that, and really think we have a great program set up to amplify the great work that's already happening in Nevada. We do have a team that is wholly dedicated to Nevada, and it's led by Andrew Linhart. You'll be hearing from him later today. He's a program manager with the Electrification Coalition. He's our Nevada team lead. Been talking to many of you over the last 6 to 8 months about where you want to go, where you can go further, how we can help. We will also be hearing later from Ben Prohaska. He's our National Director of Electrification Coalition. He and I support Andrew along with, as you'll see there, Brad, Will, Netta, Jared, and Sarah. We are all here working to help move Nevada forward. What you'll see here is a little bit about, our method and how we see many different elements coming together with the purpose of stakeholder supported policy action. We're doing all this work because we really believe in the policies that are needed to move things forward in Nevada, and it takes a lot of different approaches to make that happen. What you'll see on the right side is our State Policy Accelerator Program, where we have, we'll speak to this later, developed a blueprint for where Nevada needs to go, what policy options might make sense in the Silver State. We're working on development of different toolkits for bringing in new information and data and communication strategies that can help with that movement. Right now, we're hosting the Policy Bootcamp, which is a key part of convening leaders to share their ideas, share information, get folks engaged and excited about moving forward. And then blending that with participation with the advocacy community and pushing forward on those policies. And we're complementing that with plans around EV implementation programs, so we can build up things on the ground, prove things out, work with local leaders, and bring electrification and bolster the support around policy development. Well, I want to compliment Nevada for a great set of activities already happening around electrification. I think we've really seen just in the last couple of years a tremendous amount of positive movement forward. This slide just shows you a sampling of that. As we know from folks who were tuning in yesterday, the state formally launched its light duty ZEV program. It's Clean Cars, actually LEV and ZEV Clean Cars rulemaking program yesterday. We're gonna hear a little bit more about that from the state policy folks, but a key step in moving forward on electric vehicles alongside these other actions. So why would Nevada want to do this? We love EVs, they're great, but what's really behind this push? There's really a whole host of benefits, and we'll touch on these in many of the following sessions, but key opportunities to improve health outcomes from the reduction of air quality. And that includes many folks that are in low income areas, disadvantaged communities who often are most affected by those emissions. We're going to speak to that as well. Opportunity to expand jobs. We know about the great economic development opportunities that come from Tesla being in the state and others as well. A great opportunity, dollar and cents, as well as national security to reduce the dependency on oil. And then the opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The movement from fossil fuel vehicles to electric powered vehicles has a really strong impact on dipping that curve on CO2 emissions, alongside things like reducing vehicle miles traveled. We know that's also an important strategy within Nevada. And so we see those two working together and working complementary to move us forward. So I just want to share a few stats. We'll go over these a little bit later as well, but there's been some good progress in terms of sales, in terms of charging deployment. I think in terms of all of these criteria, if you will, the DC fast charging in the state is 6th in the nation. So that's ranking pretty high. Some solid utility investment opportunity to, get some more on the table there perhaps, and the opportunity to push on the allocation of the BW funding money. So we'll talk about that as well. So with that, I'd just like to say, buckle up, let's get started, and hopefully you will all take something away from this and have a new idea for how you can help Nevada move forward on electrification. And as I mentioned, if you need to be in touch with Andrew, who's our Nevada lead, here's a little more contact information on him. Definitely reach out to him. I'm sure folks online already know him, but if you don't, please do reach out. Okay, so that's the end of my kind of intro, kind of what to expect. We're gonna jump right into the program, and we're gonna kick things off with a speaker that really speaks to our mission on national and economic security. We're gonna be hearing from Admiral Jonathan Greenert. He has a really distinguished career in the Navy over the past 4 decades, becoming the 30th Chief of Naval Operations in 2011. He's also a member of the SAFE Energy Security Leadership Council. SAFE is the Electrification Coalition sister organization. And when he serves in that role, he's really key to providing us guidance on the ground perspective on the need for reducing our oil dependency. So Admiral, I really want to thank you for being with us today. I know you're going to share a few remarks, and then our National Director, Ben Prohaska, is going to talk to you a little bit more conversationally about the importance of this topic. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Sue. And I do appreciate no push-ups or burpees at this time of my life. It's not something I look forward to. It's my privilege to be here, and I'm really not coming to you as an admiral from my time in the Navy, but let me tell you, the reason I'm with the SAFE organization is because of my time in the Navy. I spent my time in the Navy the first half of a 40-year career as a nuclear submariner and therefore a nuclear engineer. And I learned the value of what nuclear energy can do and as an energy source. But as I spent my time in the Navy, I spent half of that time in the Pacific, looking at China, watching the rise of China and where they were headed. And near the end of my career, I spent time as an executive organizing, training, and equipping forces and deploying them around the world. And like any executive or manager, you say, well, what are we spending all of this on? Where are we sending these Navy people around the world, airplanes, ships, aircraft? And we find at any given day, if we have 100 ships out around the world, 25% of them are in the Arabian Gulf. And if you think about it, you say, why do we have to do this? I mean, is that in our national interest? And the answer to that is really no, it's not. The whole reason is to protect our petroleum resources. So you say, well, that's not really a good plan. The fact that we have to do that, that's not independent. And if you've been around long enough, you know the story of OPEC, you know the story of gas lines back in the day. So when I retired, I was introduced to SAFE and determined that, we really need to secure our energy. We need to look at that. And part of security is diversification, access to oil and control of prices, but also having the ability to turn to renewables, to nuclear power, and of course now to electric. So with SAFE, we have a recent project out there called Commanding Heights of Global Transportation. That is a project that looks at really how do we maintain the global heights for the United States with regard to transportation. And it's about the evolution or revolution of transportation towards electrification. We propose a legislative introduction, a bipartisan piece of work for both electric vehicles and battery technology. So, simply stated, electrification is important. Why? because I would tell you it's part of your economic security of the United States and part of our national security. If our economy is not safe, we're not safe. Simply put, national security is a function of protecting America, protecting Americans, and securing our economy. That's what all of our departments are mandated to do: defense, homeland security, commerce, treasury, state, etc. And the challenges for a secure economy, I would submit, are pretty much twofold. One, you have to have energy as a motive force to drive your economy. Two, you have to have access to markets. So energy, throughout our history, we've done reasonably well. We've had a lot of coal in the early days, so that was fine. We had some natural gas reserves, and we have now learned to access those better. Petroleum is a long story, and we haven't handled that all that great, I would submit. There are critical minerals, uranium, and we formed coalitions so that we could have access to uranium, but there's so much more than uranium. There are many other rare earth minerals and others. And lastly, and emerging today, is battery technology. It is about electrical vehicles, but it's also about things as simple as uninterrupted power supplies for all of our IT and our important networks, for our drones, for our unmanned military and intelligence vehicles, for robotics, and of course, as I mentioned, cars and trucks. So battery technology, a key part of the electrification, supports transportation. Transportation gets us that second piece to secure economy, access to markets. We have to have the sea lines of communication open, because 95% of all of the volume of stuff that we move to our economy and around the world goes by sea. We have to have free trade, and that's, again, part of what our Department of State and others ensure. But we have to have that, again, transportation. Battery technology is a major key to that. We have to have the processes to manufacture it. We have to have the minerals that make up the parts and the systems within a battery technology, and we have to have the market. And so what we're about in SAFE, and I think it's clear why we're joined at the hip in this with the Electrification Coalition, excuse me, is to be aware of where we are and that we need to move out. And we need perhaps government assistance to get the free market moving in this direction. The challenge is, or I'd say perhaps the threat is, China is moving very quickly and they are way out ahead of this. And we have bad precedents, as I mentioned before, with petroleum, at not being aware and not getting out ahead of it. So let me stop for a minute and take a few questions, and maybe we can clarify some of my remarks.
Great. And Admiral Greenert, thank you, first off for your service, but also for taking the time to join us today and sharing a little bit of the background with the audience in Nevada. So maybe as an immediate question that comes to mind, you talked about the idea that it's essential for the U.S. to have a secure and independent energy. Can you maybe help quantify the effects on the Department of Defense and on our military of, sort of the impact of our dependence on petroleum as a source for energy? And just, you've seen that firsthand. So I'd love to hear your thoughts a little more.
Sure. Well, what I tell you is, I just say, for lack of planning, much earlier in our history, we're stuck in the Middle East. We've been stuck in what some call the endless wars and all of that. Why were we even there? It was really to protect our access to energy. As I said in my remarks, at any given day, 25% of all of at least our naval forces, and there's a requisite amount with our other military forces, are in the Middle East. Other than protection, post 9/11, terrorism, we really don't need a large military footprint to do that. We're in there for the energy piece. So let me give you an idea of the impact of fluctuation. For $1 change in a barrel of oil, just your Navy, and you can multiply that by 3 for the entire Department of Defense, has a $30 million change in their fuel bill. So not that long ago, $60 change in the price of oil, $1.8 billion change in your fuel bill. So it's a whipsaw that we got to get out of.
That makes sense. And, I always think about the sort of great cost of, the threat to young men and women that we send overseas, the idea that we can plug in a vehicle and reduce that risk just seems like an obvious choice. Maybe talk a little bit more. You mentioned the commanding heights. I think that there is this idea that the transportation electrification is a global movement, and it is happening across the country or across the globe. Pardon me, both from a manufacturing standpoint, but also from an adoption standpoint. And so maybe just a little bit more on how critical it is for the U.S. to maintain our manufacturing base. We have a really strong history doing that for the auto industry, but I think it helps to sort of bring a finer point to the idea of the independence for energy sources and including EVs. So love any thoughts and maybe any secondary effects of this challenge too.
Sure. Well, let's just look at it from a competitive perspective, if you will. When it comes to combustible engines, we've been far ahead for really a century here in the United States. When we move, and we have to move because that's where we're going, to electrification of our transportation. Right now, China is driving that. That we will be beholden to that. That is not a good place to be. In the case of oil, there was an organization, OPEC, it's still around, but those that held the oil, some were friends and some were not. We will find ourselves in a situation of a nation and an institution that does not like us. They have a different plan, they have a different goal, and we have to be competitive in that regard. So we put ourselves at risk if we don't move out sooner than later, use our innovation, use the power of our economy to move along in electrification. And the foundation of that is our battery technology. The secondary aspects of this, of not keeping up with that, will be increased prices and loss of access. And we lose our ability to influence that if we're not ahead of that, and we don't want to turn to our military and those kind of options with regard to China in this.
Well, Admiral, as you can imagine, one of the moments that always challenges us here is we never have enough time with someone like you. But sadly, we need to move on to our next segment. So once again, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts, your engagement with SAFE and the EC. And we'll look forward to more opportunities, hopefully, to engage you both in the work in Nevada, but across the country. So with that, I'll pass it back to Sue, and really appreciate you taking the time.
Great. Thank you, Admiral, so much. And thank you, Ben. We're going to turn our attention now to the intersection of electric vehicles, air quality, and public health. I think we were all really amazed by what we saw during the pandemic as motor vehicle driving, really kind of ground to a halt, and suddenly the blue sky was there where we maybe didn't think it existed. I think there's a real opportunity to think about how electric vehicles can achieve some of the same results without some of the damaging economic side effects of that kind of scenario. So we're really excited to hear from two experts from the American Lung Association. We will have Melissa Ramos here today. She's the manager of advocacy for clean air for the American Lung Association in Nevada. And then also Will Barrett, who's the director of advocacy for American Lung Association, and he works very closely with the state of California. So together, we've got some great information to present to you, and I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. As she mentioned, my name is Melissa Ramos. I'm the manager for clean air advocacy for the American Lung Association based in Las Vegas, and I'm joined with my boss, Will Barrett, the director for clean air advocacy in Sacramento. We'll be presenting on two of our signature reports, State of the Air and Road to Clean Air, both which highlight the public health benefits to reducing carbon emissions and expanding our EV sector. As I'm sure you're all aware or may have seen by now, Governor Sisolak released the Nevada Climate Strategy last Tuesday, which provides a roadmap to get us on track with our GHG reductions as outlined by SB 254, which requires a 45% reduction by 2030 and a net zero reduction by 2050. So our transportation sector is the largest contributor to overall carbon emissions in our state, poor air quality, and has significant impacts to our health. So if you could just go to the first slide there, thank you. So every year, the American Lung Association issues a State of the Air report, which is our annual National Air Quality Report Card, which helps people learn about their local air quality and ways to better protect themselves and their families. It's compiled using US EPA quality assured data by county, and we focus on two key pollutants, which are ozone and particle pollution. These are the two most common dangerous air pollutants. And we provide grades and rankings based on this data in terms of most polluted or cleanest across the US. Next slide. This report has documented the success of the Clean Air Act, which measures to clean up pollution and overall air quality. However, over the past 4 years, we've seen a significant trend of America's air quality actually getting worse due to climate change. Climate change is increasing the number of harmful air pollutants, rising temperatures, and more frequent and intense wildfire, which results in more ozone and particle pollution. And these drivers are creating a public health crisis and poses a great risk to our health. And it also leads to health issues such as asthma, cardiovascular harm, respiratory issues, in some cases, premature death. And as you can see here, these health impacts are felt more heavily by our most vulnerable populations. Our 2020 State of the Air report found that nearly 5 in 10 Americans live in counties with unhealthy air, and the burdens of air pollution are disproportionately impacting communities of color and lower income. And then as you can see here, people of color are 1.5 times more likely to live in a county with unhealthy air. Next slide. While many areas in the state have made significant progress, there is still more work to be done to ensure all our communities are breathing clean and healthy air. Our report found that Las Vegas ranked 9th for top 10 cities across the country for ozone pollution. In terms of particle pollution, Reno and Vegas are among the top 25 cities nationwide for highest number of particle days. The data shows compared to last year, Nevada saw increases in the number of unhealthy ozone and particle pollution days. And there are approximately 2.9 million residents living in counties with failing grades for ozone and particle pollution. Next slide. This chart shows that since the implementation of the Clean Air Act, there's been improvements to air quality, but over the past few years, extreme heat and wildfire have impacted this progress. The findings of our State of the Air report highlight that climate change is making it increasingly difficult to protect our health and clean our air. Now I'll just turn it over to Will to explain the benefits of cleaning up our transportation sector, which is the main source of carbon emissions for the state of Nevada.
Hi, thanks, Melissa. We can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So I'm Will Barrett. I'm the Director of Clean Air Advocacy based in Sacramento, California, and work closely with our staff across the country on state level air and climate issues. The first slide here is really teeing up the Road to Clean Air report that we issued in September. Basically, what we wanted to do was, knowing that the transportation sector is the leading source of harmful pollution that threatens public health and drives climate change, we wanted to show that or what the public health and climate change benefits would be with a major shift across the board to zero emission technologies. So what we did was took a look at what would the public health benefits be if various sectors in the transportation, on-road transportation sources shifted to 100% sales over the coming decades. This chart is really laying out our scenario, looking at 100% sales of school buses, transit buses, and airport shuttles in the current decade, and then moving to 100% sales in passenger vehicles, garbage trucks, and delivery vans, and other medium and heavy duty vehicles, and then on to 2045 with 100% sales of basically long haul trucks, whether combined or tractor trailer combinations. We also looked at port trucks, which are essentially a subcategory of the heavy duty trucks. And what we found, if you go to the next slide, by comparing essentially our scenario to a standard run of the US EPA's MOVES model, their transportation model, and looking at the upstream emissions impacts and benefits of the shift to electrification. We basically look at a total of $72 billion annually based on a single year's emission reductions, that being 2050 in this case. So again, on an annual basis, we calculate $72 billion in public health benefits and an additional $113 billion in global climate change benefits based on a calculation of the social cost of carbon. So from a public health benefit perspective, that's over 6,000 premature deaths, 93,000 asthma attacks avoided, 400,000 plus lost workdays avoided because the air is cleaner and people's health is improved as we have shifted away from tailpipes and to zero emission technologies. And also important to know that we coupled that with an increasing reliance on renewable energy based on Bloomberg New Energy Finance projections. So basically, widespread public health benefits are seen because the transportation sector is such a dominant source of harmful air pollutants and climate pollutants in the United States. Our report, and you can go to the next slide, our report breaks down these benefits on the state and in some cases the metropolitan area levels. For Nevada, we see $745 million in annual public health benefits due to the shift to increasing sales of zero emission technologies. And for the Las Vegas area alone, that's over $600 million in annual public health benefits. And all of this translates into reductions in premature deaths, reductions in asthma attacks, healthier populations, and fewer disparities, as Melissa noted, in populations impacted by transportation pollution. So we can go to the next slide. This is sort of how we get there. And as noted at the beginning, Nevada is on the way in some ways, and certainly we have a long way to go to get there, but we're moving forward with adopting the California vehicle standards. We're also, in our report, these policy recommendations are focused on the state level, looking at ways that we can invest more heavily in public charging infrastructure, looking to pursue basically leading by example, having public fleets lead the way in terms of school buses, transit buses, and other public fleets moving to zero emission technologies as quickly as possible. And then looking at ways that we can support consumer choices through incentive programs, whether that's retirement of older vehicles with matched with consumer purchase incentives or other non-financial incentives that can be helpful in making the clean air choice. We also know, we'll continue as a lung association to work with our state and local leaders at the air districts and at the state level to really make sure we're protecting the progress that has been made and know that we have to ramp up. So on the last slide, basically just a few links to our reports and contact information for both Melissa and myself. And really appreciate you taking the time and really would like to continue the conversation with Ben and others after the call. Thanks.
Great. Will, it's always a pleasure to see you again and to meet you, Michelle. And you may hear a dog shake in the background, or Melissa, pardon me, not Michelle. So apologies for that. I was referencing that I always have a challenge pronouncing epidemiological studies, but probably something you all use in your everyday language. When you think about the sort of impact of EVs on air quality, are there like some examples where you've started to already see some of the market adoption start to have a direct impact and starting to see changes in how those communities function and the impacts of the air quality?
Sure. Well, I would just say that, we know that there's significant harm caused by tailpipe emissions, especially when we're looking at the heavy duty sector. So as we're looking at, the reduction in diesel exhaust, for example, which is a carcinogenic pollutant, it causes asthma attacks, heart attacks, strokes even, and premature deaths. We know there's just a clear benefit to the transition. So as we've seen the momentum build, we're really hopeful that, we'll continue to see as tailpipes go away, we'll see cleaner air as a result, and that cleaner air really is accruing in communities that are currently being extremely harmfully burdened by air pollution.
And apologies, I was not only was he shaking, but he started to talk as well. I think we have time for one more quick question. We have a packed agenda, but interested if there's any like sort of immediate lessons learned about work from California that you all would share. Obviously you've worked in a lot of locations across the country, and ALA has a huge impact. But any quick lessons to share before we move on and go to our next segment?
Sure. What I would say from the California perspective is, as we've continued to build our policy framework to support electrification, it really has taken quite a bit of focus on the light duty sector, but also really the medium and heavy duty sector. We know that's such a dominant source of our ozone challenges. So our smoggy days in California that are so famous, unfortunately. We know we need to focus across the board. It's not simply passenger vehicles. It's building out the infrastructure to support consumers and commercial applications for the medium and heavy duty, as well as transit, school buses, those kind of things. And there's been a lot of progress there, and we're excited to see in the governor's climate strategy the focus on medium and heavy duty electrification in Nevada.
Thanks so much. Well, Melissa and Will, we're very excited that you all continue to be such a big part of the work in Nevada. Really appreciate the efforts from the American Lung Association to bring the health perspective to this issue, and hope you'll stay on for the remainder of the program. But we're going to move to our next thing, so I'm going to pass the mic back to Sue.
Thank you,
and look forward to connecting again.
Great. Yes, thank you, Melissa and Will. We're going to continue the conversation. It came up a little bit in the presentation around the impact of air quality on communities of color. And we're going to just really focus on this topic for a bit, the notion of integrating equity concerns and considerations into the future of Nevada's electrification transformation. And we're really pleased to be able to touch on this topic. We know it's one that's been gaining in prominence, realizing the need to address things like systemic racism, and just consider ways that we can bring the benefits of electrification, the many, many benefits of electrification, but particularly around, air quality as well to all of our citizens. So we've asked Rudy Zamora to join us and share a little bit of his knowledge on that. He's the program director for CHISPA Nevada. It's a community organizing program of the League of Conservation Voters. Rudy's been there since 2015, really building the power of low-income Latinx Nevadans in the fight against climate change. And I think on a personal note, Rudy has a son with asthma. And so every day that he goes out to try and fight for clean air, I'm sure he's keeping his son in mind as well. So Rudy, thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights here.
Thank you, Sue. Happy to be here today. I think the first thing to acknowledge today is that this is a really big topic, and it's going to be really difficult to cover in 10 to 15 minutes, but we are really glad that the Electrification Coalition is helping facilitate this discussion and making equity part of the bootcamp. Equity must be central to all policy discussions. And there's 5 things that we really must look at when we're talking about equity when talking about electric vehicles. The first one is, the first task is to understand what community wants and needs. And what we mean by that is oftentimes electric vehicle policy starts with, how do we reach a certain emissions goal? And it's not really centered on people and what communities need, but on a policy goal that fits a broader climate plan. The climate plan should be directed not just to protect our environment, but also our people. We're all part of the same environment. In that same category, what's actually going to make people's life better, what's actually going to clean up the air that we breathe and the water that we drink. We need to let communities tell us what they need instead of assuming that a solution is simple and simply is as simple or simply replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric ones. This also means building authentic relationships with groups or leaders that are rooted in community, not just the politicians, the policy groups, or the advocates. And again, I think that is the biggest one in this category that we need to look at, and that's building the authentic relationships. And in order to do that, we need to be able to provide information that's accessible in multiple ways, that's culturally competent, it's multilingual, that it's targeted specifically to difficult to reach communities. We need to meet people where they are And one of the best examples that we have is the Green Lighting Institute has great resources on how to do community needs assessments for e-mobility projects. And that's the first thing that needs to happen when we're looking at how do we bring equity to the table. And again, I highly encourage people to go to the Green Lighting Institute handbook and then contact them with any questions or just simply look at their toolkits. The second big thing for us is understanding what it means to what we mean by electric vehicles. Often when we talk about electric vehicles, we picture personal vehicles, but what we need to address might not just be individual cars, but carpooling, ride sharing, public transit, buses, school buses, and other models of transportation like bicycles and pedestrians, walkways, and communities might have concerns about accessing clean vehicles, but also accessing the electric opportunities that come with that transition to EVs. So it shouldn't just be a Tesla or Prius that we're encouraging for folks to buy, or even the Chevy Volt. We need to widen our perspectives on electric transportation. Transportation is just how we get around. And if we're honest, in Las Vegas, having a car is basically a requirement, but it shouldn't have to be this way. We've been taking a step back and trying to understand mobility as a whole, rather than just personal vehicles. Chispa started out with a campaign to electrify school buses because that was something achievable. We had available funds from the Volkswagen Settlement Fund. There was a clear case for electrifying the school buses that children ride, and it was something that our community could rally behind. That wasn't just asking them to change their lives or demand cleaner air for their children. With the larger climate problems we're trying to solve, we need to encourage different types of mobility, not just cars, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions overall. The third bullet that I want to make today is the most important thing to look at is to understand the problem we're trying to solve, and that's climate change. And that unless we center and prioritize communities most harmed by climate change, we're not going to solve the problem. And again, oftentimes we look at policy and we try to solve something without really making a community assessment. We see advocates viewing equity as a box to check, and it's unfortunate to see that. And that's not what equity is. Equity is centering the people most harmed by the problem and the policies that are going to provide the solution. Is one piece of the policy. It's how the whole policy should be structured. Equity requires a strong commitment all the way through. And again, this is something that we've seen as an afterthought. I like to refer to it as putting a band-aid to the problem. We'll come back and address it later. But we see that low-income Black, Indigenous, and Latinx and Asian American communities are most harmed by climate change. Our government has allowed corporations to pollute right where we live. Our communities have been forced by redlining, economic pressures, and other forms of discrimination to live in the most polluted neighborhoods. Governments has historically placed polluters over people, and polluters have put profits over people. And that's how we reach this moment where we are at risk of an unlivable climate. We see extreme heat, severe droughts, increasing wildfires, unbreathable air. None of this is happening on its own. It's happening because polluters were allowed to chase profits above everything else. And it's low-income communities of color who are bearing the brunt of the consequences. That's who we organize at Chispa, because we recognize that these are the communities who are not well represented in decisions about climate change because they're not the ones with the power. So when we're thinking about electric vehicles, the electric vehicle policy, we really need to think, how can we craft our goals so that they focus on people who are hit first and worst by climate change and environmental pollution? And we need to be clear about defining the population and creating a policy specifically for that population. Fourth, we need to address the obvious realities head on. To be successful, we need to address accessibility. Any kind of electric vehicle right now, car, bus, or otherwise, saves money long-term, but it has a high upfront cost. For agencies or individuals who are medium to low income, this is a significant barrier. Pretending that the lifetime cost of a vehicle outweighs the immediate investment is not being honest with our community, and we need to create policies that address that. We've talked about making that transition, but the reality is our communities, again, cannot afford that upfront cost in order to make that transition. We also need infrastructure. If we're focusing on communities most affected by transportation pollution, we need to invest in charging infrastructure for the vehicles that service and drive through those communities. Investing in charging infrastructure historically underserved communities is critical for increasing electric vehicle adoption. Finally, the process matters. We need a community-driven process as we make this transition. Just like we need to start with a community needs assessment as projects and policies move forward, we need to keep talking to communities. We need to fund outreach and education. We need to create solutions and partnerships with them. Going back to that first point of creating authentic relationships within communities. We also need to be flexible and understand that different communities will have different needs. Some communities may just need incentives to switch their personal vehicles. Other communities might be able to afford new EVs. Others will need to look at used electric vehicles. Others will need different forms of investment in other transportation or transit options. And who implements the process also matters. Utilities, private companies, and government agencies all have different motivations, but we need to be united in cleaning up our models of transportation. In conclusion, we need to know what we need to get through in conclusion, we know that we need to go through a big transition in Nevada to protect our state from climate change. We need to make sure that policies are equitable, accessible, and affordable to low-income communities of color from the get-go to be successful in our goals. Thank you.
Great, Rudy. Well, thanks so much for the background. As someone who, I grew up in New Mexico, and then my parents moved to the Las Vegas area for about 9 years. And so, in some ways I'm based out east, but I feel like I have a real connection to a lot of the ways that these issues play out and have seen them, sort of direct. But I'm interested in, you're thinking about, and maybe even just helping people get a better grasp of, are there differences in the way that we think about the like Latinx community or other communities of color, or equity specifically, and how those might be different in Northern Nevada versus Southern Nevada? Because I think, in some ways it is, they're very different communities, but I think it's interesting to give people a sense of how that might play out in thinking about the transportation landscape.
Yeah, when we're looking at the state, and you said you're familiar with the state a little bit, we have the Nevada and the Washoe area, and then we have the rest of the state, which is rural. So looking at those three areas is completely different. Something that we might need in Southern Nevada and Las Vegas might be completely different from something that the Washoe or the Reno area needs, as opposed to what our rural communities need. So making sure that we're doing those community assessments to understand what each one of those communities need is going to be the main part. Because I can tell you, as someone that works in Southern Nevada, and that's my big focus, Southern Nevada, is our transportation, we've talked to communities, and as many of us would love to make that transition to electric vehicles, it's not something that we can go out tomorrow or in the next couple of months and say, we're going to go buy an electric vehicle. So we need to look at, how do we make mobility more accessible, and how do we make that transition into electric fleets? So the RTC, how do we make the buses electric? How do we make school buses electric? How do we create incentives for community to start buying that? And one of the things that always comes to mind is, when we're talking about communities of color, is, do we talk about the electric vehicle? Do we talk about the infrastructure first? And it can be one or the other. It has to be the two of them going hand in hand, because as I was mentioning in the presentation, we need the infrastructure. The infrastructure is currently not in our neighborhoods, is not in the areas that we live or the places that we work in. So when we're looking at buying that electric vehicle, we oftentimes say, well, where am I going to charge it? Where are we going to do that? So, but if we put electric charging stations in neighborhoods, people are going to be like, well, why are we putting these up? No one in the neighborhood has an electric vehicle. So they cannot be siloed off. They need to go hand in hand. And again, I think to answer the question is making sure that we are making that community assessment and talking to communities and talking to day-to-day folks and seeing what it is that they need, and not just talking to us advocates or policymakers, because oftentimes we are so far removed and we think we're finding a solution to the problem, and that's not really the solution that the community is looking for.
We have to move on, but maybe in moving on, I'm going to ask you one question that you can kind of quickly answer. I think sometimes the idea of equity is not understanding the intended impacts or unintended impacts of a policy mechanism. So case in point, the federal tax credit isn't great for low-income communities because they don't have access to tax liability in the same way that others do, right? But sometimes it's hard to sort of think through those steps when you're trying to do something to augment or influence the market. So I'm wondering if, in your role at SPEA and your work so far, if you've already thought about or have ideas for some of those first step policies that you think are going to have the best impact to solving the equity issue.
We have not, and what we're doing right now is we're doing a community assessment. We're talking to our promotores, to our neighbors, to see what they would prefer to see. I wish I had a clear answer for you, but we're still in that process of making that community assessment because we want to make sure that we're representing community.
Perfect. I think that's a case in point of not checking the box, right? This is the idea that we need to make sure those voices are represented in the policy discussion. And so really appreciate your efforts. Look forward to working with you and others on the team more. And, hopefully finding another time when we can all be back in Nevada. It'll be one of those things that'll be fun to get back there in person, like I think we all would like to be. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sue, but thanks again for your thoughtful comments and being a part of this today, Rudy.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And thanks, Rudy. Tremendous conversation thus far. Everybody has earned a little bit of a break. So we are going to take a coffee break for the next 10 minutes. And then I do want to let folks know that 11:05, we will be launching a really quick and fun Menti exercise. This is a polling visualization tool that we've had a lot of fun with. It's a chance for everyone listening to share some of their ideas and some of their policy thoughts as well. And then we can all kind of see and visualize what that looks like. So we will put in the chat the link to the Menti. It's MENTI. You'll be able to click on that at around 11:05, and in real time, we'll see what's on everyone's minds in terms of EVs in Nevada. So until then, please go ahead, stretch, grab some coffee. We will start our state panel. You don't want to miss this at 11:10. All right. Thanks, everyone. All right. Well, we are thrilled for this next session. We are going to be joined by a quartet of state leaders that play key roles in setting and advancing the vision for EVs in Nevada. And I'm just going to, turn things over without further ado to our Nobel Prize winning Dr. Kristen Avert to introduce her colleagues. She's going to lead them in a discussion of how each of the agencies is playing a role and what they will be working on in the future. So let me turn it over to you, Kristen.
Thanks so much, Sue. I really appreciate it. So I'm really looking forward to this panel. We're going to have a really interesting discussion around what the state of EVs is here in Nevada. In Nevada, we launched our state climate strategy just a week ago. And as everybody is aware, transportation is the greatest source of emissions in the state. And as part of that strategy, we did investigate and evaluate what the adoption of clean cars would look like in the state. And we outlined why this is a difficult issue and all the complexities that need to be considered in order to ensure that there is penetration and really true decarbonization of the transportation sector. So with that, I'd like to introduce my three colleagues and then ask each of them to present some opening comments as it relates to electric vehicles and decarbonization of transportation in Nevada. First, we have Administrator Greg Lovato. He is in charge of the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection. David Bobzian, he is the Director of the Governor's Office of Energy. And Sandra Rosenberg, who is the Deputy Director of Planning at the Nevada Department of Transportation. And so, Greg, let's start with you.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Right now, NDEP, this is really a new area for us. We've, quickly recognized, the largest sector of our emissions is transportation. The largest sector is light duty vehicles in terms of GHG emissions. And so, with the available tools we had in front of us, we're already teaming up with the Department of Motor Vehicles and pursuing, clean cars. We recognize this is in the context in terms of overall electrification, that there's a lot of other factors at play. Obviously, grid infrastructure, and then, affordability. And so, what we're trying to do is go through a very deliberate evaluation process to evaluate adoption of low emission and zero emission vehicles standards in Nevada. And I think that kind of speaks to, the expectation that Nevada is setting for itself in terms of, deliberate policy evaluation and stakeholder input, and looking at, all the factors that are involved. We realize that multiple things will have to happen in parallel to be successful, but that shouldn't, paralyze us. We should be able to move forward. And we have a robust process. We just kicked off yesterday with a webinar, and we'll be continuing that over the next year. So that's our first step, and I'll talk more about some other steps in terms of NDEP's role in our coming questions.
Thanks, Greg. So David.
Thanks, Kristen. And thank you, Electrification Coalition, for bringing together this great convening. And thank you, everyone who's spending the day around this very important topic. My name is David Bobzien, and I serve as the Director of the Nevada Governor's Office of Energy for Governor Steve Sisolak. Our primary role in this discussion is infrastructure, and we see our office as occupying a very unique point in time with a very unique responsibility, and that is really kickstarting the deployment of charging infrastructure necessary for electric vehicle adoption in the state. As you're probably aware, our flagship program in that space is the Nevada Electric Highway, a program that was started in the prior administration to electrify 5 corridors in the state: Interstate 80, Interstate 15, US 50, US 95, and US 93, primarily as an economic development opportunity and a tourism opportunity, ensuring that drivers could seamlessly travel all across our state using electric vehicles. Under Governor Sisolak, this program has taken on a new imperative, and that is of responding to the climate crisis. I think the question of the future of charging infrastructure, what the business models are, what the investment models are around that infrastructure is a fascinating one that will evolve through many stages in the years to come. But where we are is providing some public engagement in that story, ensuring that areas that are probably not going to be the first to serve in private investment models, and those are the rural corridors, allowing drivers, no matter where they're located, certainly predominantly in the urban areas, to be able to use their electric vehicles to again get around the state. So in addition to the Nevada Electric Highway, we partner with NV Energy on some new programs that are to provide support and incentives for charging infrastructure deployment. And that is in the government space, whether we're talking state parks, whether we're talking local libraries, government facilities, as opportunities to provide public charging opportunities, as well as low-income multifamily residential environments, recognizing that renters in Nevada have a unique challenge when it comes to EV ownership in terms of being able to access charging. So again, we look at this from an infrastructure perspective, but again, we also look at it from an economic development perspective, understanding that, you know, Nevada is, as many are rightfully quick to point out, an auto manufacturing state. We make electric vehicles, and because of our auto manufacturing, lithium-ion batteries are currently ranked 11th as of 2019 as an export for Nevada. So we see this as nothing but a fantastic future ahead of us. Certainly as a main driver, if you will, of economic recovery in this post-COVID world. And so we're very confident that the future is very bright in Nevada.
Thanks, David. And Sandra.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sandra Rosenberg. I'm the Assistant Director for Planning at the Nevada Department of Transportation. And I also had a role in the climate strategy, leading up the transportation transformation group, working on some of these very, very challenging issues. I really want to thank the organizers of this effort for their thoughtful approach in looking at transportation electrification, as it will no doubt play a critical role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Something we're not only supportive of the state, but have made in an agency measure as well, in terms of, NDOT measuring the greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. Not just, our agency and not just EVs, but really as a statewide goal for the state as well as our department alone. However, I also want to note that NDOT and other transportation agencies cannot separate this issue from other related issues. We really can't discuss electrification without thinking about transportation funding, transportation options, access, and mobility equity. So I was really pleased to hear Rudy talk just before us. I'll be reaching out. There's a number of those issues that are really critically important to NDOT, and we hope that we can partner with you as we deal with some of these mobility issues in the broader scheme. I wanted to note that the 2019 legislature passed Senate Concurrent Resolution 3, acknowledging the need to further electric vehicles and other climate initiatives, while also recognizing the need to develop a more sustainable transportation funding source. After numerous meetings and great discussions on background of funding and potential solutions, there was a recognition that it's really a complex issue and requires a more in-depth analysis while engaging a large number of diverse stakeholders, including possibly or likely many of you. As such, NDOT will be leading a study and convening working groups over the next 2 years to evaluate potential new transportation funding strategies to balance climate, environmental, social equity, and funding sustainability needs. While NDOT will continue to be a supporter and partner in electrification, our goals are to enhance safety, preserve infrastructure, optimize mobility, transform economies, foster sustainability, and connect communities. And that requires that we focus on improving equity in transportation, reducing demand by providing options to single occupancy trips, and establishing sustainable to achieve these initiatives. I want to reiterate that we are an active supporter and partner in electrification, but we must do it in a thoughtful and collaborative way that meets multiple goals and does not further some of the current inequities of the transportation system and how we fund it. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. So I want to ask a couple questions that really actually dive a little bit deeper into what you all started off with. And I think, you all touched on in kind of a general sense what your respective agencies and offices, what your role is in terms of transportation electrification. I wonder if you could elaborate, provide a little bit more detail in that space, but also what agencies do you think are missing that you would think need to be part of this kind of panel or this kind of discussion? Who else needs to be at that larger table from the state perspective to have these discussions? And actually, let's start with you, Sandra.
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to see that equity piece being discussed here. We don't want to let it hold us back from investing in cleaner transportation, but there's a number of complex issues. So I'm happy to see organizations that represent typically underrepresented groups. I also think that it's important to bring in entities that maybe are thinking about, as Rudy mentioned, sharing options, active transportation folks. So even though this effort is focused on electrification, as I mentioned, those issues are intertwined with this, as well as local agencies that are responsible for the land use piece of our planning, bringing in that zoning and land use planning discussion, both to discuss, electrification infrastructure, but also just a more sustainable and efficient transportation system as a whole.
So I hear a little bit of what you're alluding to. It's the broader conversation in the state around, again, these complex issues. It's, you have that electrification conversation that needs to happen, but then you know, mass transit, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, and same with development, et cetera. I mean, these are all cascading and touch point issues. Did I kind of capture that, Sandra?
Yeah, I think so. You know, looking at, it's great that we have groups that are focused on each of these key issues like electrification. Bring information into the broader conversation about transportation sustainability. So I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time figuring out exact agencies, but again, that marrying the detailed electrification issues with the broader, you know, transportation equity and sustainability issues.
Right. So David, as a former assemblyman and councilman, I wonder where your perspectives are in terms of that, the size of the table around electrification, state agencies and others, and those external roles. Any comments there?
Yeah, I'd like to kind of bridge off of what Sandra said, and we very much appreciate NDOT's participation in our climate planning. Both Sandra, other staff at NDOT, and certainly Director Swallow rightfully pointing out the context for this whole conversation is that, you know, it's not enough just to flip all the vehicles, all the single-use passenger vehicles to EVs. You also have to have broader, more comprehensive transportation planning that cuts down on VMTs and emissions overall. And that's a very far-reaching conversation around land use and everything else. And so Sandra's right. I would echo that about the local agencies participating in that. A specific point that I would make that's germane to our work at the Governor's Office of Energy is when it comes to building codes. We are very active and have a state responsibility for adopting the most recent version of the International Energy Conservation Code. And there's a lot of movement in that space to modernize and evolve that code to a more electrified future. And a big part of that is a look ahead towards making sure that future construction is EV charging ready. There's some fits and starts to that, but there's some opportunity for local governments as they're adopting that code to possibly go beyond what the next version is going to have to be prepared for the building stock that is to come being ready for EV charging. It is certainly a chicken and the egg kind of thing, but if we are future-proofing our future building stock, making sure that it is ready for future residents, future customers, patronizing businesses that can then, you know, plug in their vehicles. That's a key role that local governments can play. Another player that is not currently able to join us at this table just because of our pandemic economic situation, and as an agency, they've suffered really the brunt of this at the state, and that is the Department of Tourism. In the past, they have partnered with the Governor's Office of Energy to highlight our Nevada Electric Highway, to highlight the tourism opportunities, both in urban areas and in the rural quarters of our state, through transportation electrification. And so we look forward to, you know, post-pandemic when that agency can be back up and running to a point where they can participate. That'll be another player to have at the table.
So I want to follow up on some, you know, you just touched on two important points about the infrastructure and kind of where does that responsibility lie in terms of investments in infrastructure, designing what it looks like. I mean, with California going to with their ZEV standard, I mean, we all know what the California influx that we get across I-15, right, on the weekends, and then also up in Tahoe, in the Tahoe region. So I'm just kind of curious that nexus with tourism, energy. How do you see that in terms of that kind of responsibility?
Well, I think it's evolving. Certainly you mentioned in California, totally different scale in terms of how they view infrastructure, and it's a broader conversation for them. Primarily, it sits with their business department, the deployment of charging infrastructure, the setting of standards, et cetera. So, you know, for Nevada, we have responsibility again for promoting investments in infrastructure, but we also quickly come into conversations with the jurisdiction of the Public Utilities Commission as they're trying to figure out the rate structures and underpinnings of charging. And so they're certainly a part of that discussion as well. I would also like to highlight that Nevada is one of the co-chairs of what is known as the Rev West effort. And that is regional EV efforts primarily around infrastructure of 8 Western states. We're talking red states, blue states, states with varying perspectives on climate, on greenhouse gas emissions, but also the tourism opportunities of transportation electrification. And so there's a lot of discussion amongst those states about looking toward the standards for charging infrastructure, recognizing that the stations and the technologies behind them are evolving, and making sure that as those investments are being made, that they are future-proofed against the next generation of charging technology that's coming.
Thanks, David. So, Greg, as the administrator of a regulatory organization, entity, I should say, I wonder what your kind of perspectives are in more detail about NDUP's role, particularly now that you are moving forward with consideration of the rulemaking on clean cars, and more broadly, again, with other touch points with other agencies.
Right. So one thing to point out is, from the Volkswagen settlement, the state benefited from roughly 25 million. There was a set aside for electrical infrastructure, that charging infrastructure that the Office of Energy, put to work. We actually, competitively bid quite a bit and leveraged quite a bit of funds for electrification of some pretty large, emission sources at, some of the airlines. Those have been, on hold a little bit pending, the current economic situation. But, through that effort, we've been, working with schools, so we've really touched, I think, in terms of, reduction of emissions from buses, but I think there's this, kind of activation energy of funding that's needed to really transform, individual emission sources, to make up for, infrastructure changes, other technical improvements that need to be made. And so, I think that, with NDEP, we're open to, not only pursuing just basic pollution control measures. We're going to be looking at medium and heavy duty truck emissions after we tackle clean cars, possibly joining, the states that have joined in a memorandum of understanding to look at adoption of those, what is involved with that. I think what we're seeing, though, is, as you mentioned at the very beginning, the success of any of these measures, has to do with the level of penetration. And so, while we understand that we have a key role to play in terms of, transforming our fleet, the actions we take, are not going to be enough to drive down emissions in the transportation sector. We're going to need investments in infrastructure and people's ability to afford and adopt these, technologies to really get momentum going. I think we're forming those partnerships, some of these pilot projects, as I mentioned, bus replacements, the VW settlements have, we've made those contacts. So, we know who to talk to, and we know how to make sure that, money can be used productively and quickly to drive down emissions. So, we do see ourselves playing a vital role, but we know we're going to have to integrate with, a number of other entities, and not just at the local level, but also in the private sector. We're actually seeing, I think in the next year, we're going to see deployment of heavy equipment, electric vehicles at some of the mines. And so, understanding what's driving that, understanding how the state can support that and communicate, what's available is going to be important from, again, an economic and driving down emissions perspective.
Thanks for that. So I want to talk, I feel like we always think about personal vehicles so often when we are thinking about electrification, but when we're really thinking about transforming the entire sector, I mean, we're even thinking about boats and planes, but the first thing I think about, and you touched on this, Greg, are, kind of trucks, and whether light duty and heavy duty. And we have over 80% public lands. It's a long drive. People out of state, right? They think it's like a 30-minute drive between Reno and Las Vegas. I'm like, oh, no. It's basically your entire day, right? We have, between rural communities, there's long distances to travel. So I'm kind of curious about the state role in ensuring that our rural communities, for example, have access to, understand perhaps the value of electric vehicles and electric trucks, and what the challenges might be in terms of adoption across our communities. I wonder if anybody would like to talk about that more broadly. David?
I'll take first crack at that. Look, a big partnership with the Nevada Electric Highway is actually our rural electric co-ops. MV Energy has really built out a huge part of the footprint of the Nevada Electric Highway, but we also have the smaller co-ops that have been very excited about the opportunities around transportation electrification. The Overton Power District, we partnered with them most recently, and this was, January, feels like a decade ago, pre-pandemic. We were able to do a ribbon cutting in Mesquite at the Flying J for the charging station that's there, and that allowed us to complete the criteria that we needed for designation by Federal Highway Administration of the Nevada portion of I-15 as an EV charging corridor. So my point here is that we see a lot of excitement on behalf of the co-ops in the rural areas to promote transportation electrification. There's something else that I think we're on the cusp of right now in terms of the market itself. And for those individual passenger vehicles, obviously, the offerings for, sedans right now, when you look at total cost of ownership, I don't know who in their right mind would actually buy a brand new, sorry to be bagging on Honda, who would actually buy a Honda Accord when they look at the total cost of ownership versus say like a Nissan Leaf right now. So the sedan value proposition is pretty clear. Next up, everyone's favorite vehicle in Nevada, light duty pickup trucks. We're seeing, coming out soon, the EF-150. Certainly at the high end, we've been bombarded with advertising for the Hummer, but then also, the Rivian offerings coming. Who knows what you think about the Tesla Cybertruck? But I think once we start to see those different vehicle types become more plentiful and hopefully show up on the lots in Nevada, we'll be ready to go. And actually, that'll be a great jumping off is going to be the Nevada Electric Highway, the fact that we do have rural charging available so that if you want to, do the Nevada adventure with a four-wheel drive pickup, you will be able to do it electrified in just a short period of time.
So okay, go ahead, Sandra.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that. So, great points, David, about, first having the infrastructure at reasonable distances for charging, but we're still talking about personally owned vehicles. And I think something that's going to be a huge challenge, California's starting to dip their toe into it in a few other states, is the commercial vehicles. So the big trucks, they're big, they're heavy, the amount of batteries that it would take to do it. I know there's manufacturers that are working on it. But I also know that California is very much invested in hydrogen infrastructure as well, which may provide another source that may have longer distances for those big, heavy trucks. So we're watching what's happening there, with the hydrogen work there, with the electrification of trucks there. Something I think that probably deserves some additional research is, and I want to be very clear, and that's not yet committed to this, but we are willing to research it, is in-road charging. If there was an opportunity for vehicles to charge as they drive, these range issues would potentially disappear. That's an early concept. I think there's been a little preliminary research on it, but it's something we're willing to look into a little bit more because we have large spaces. There's a tremendous amount of freight moving across the country that starts by going across our state. And we need to really look at those big trucks in addition to those passenger vehicles.
I read about that driving charging. That is so cool. It's such an amazing concept. So, you touched on two, I think, really important things. It's this at the beginning of your remarks, Sandra, on SCR3 and just, how do we support, basically separate the financing of our roads, et cetera, from basically gas tax. So I'm kind of curious, if you look at every other state that has actually adopted a clean car rule, they at some point had an incentive program. Given the budgetary situation that we're in, and that we have no income tax, and that, just the economic situation that we're in, what do you think is the role of the state, and what do you think are creative solutions that we could explore in terms of whether it is an incentive program or rebate? I'm kind of curious what you think about how do we get people into that adoption space, whether it's EVs or other zero emission vehicles. Any comments? David.
I'll take first crack at this one. Yeah, I mean, this is an important point, and it is one that we need attention paid to, certainly by our legislators, policymakers, and that is, what are we doing, and what should we be doing, and frankly, what is the time horizon for such a program's appropriateness, knowing that the costs are coming down quickly. What can we do to assist consumers with getting them over the hump, making the decision to purchase and own an electric vehicle? As you pointed out, certainly the pandemic economic situation makes what was already going to be a difficult conversation even more difficult in terms of being able to find money to fuel an incentive program of some sort. And your point is well taken. I mean, Nevada has such a constrained tax structure that it doesn't lend itself easily to the types of programs that are found in other states that have gone forward with ZEV rules. I'm hopeful that we may see a renewed conversation about this at the federal level, but I think at the end of the day, we can't bank on that. I also think it's important that we look toward the equity side of this as well, knowing that, I mean, personally in my mind, once we have a vibrant secondary market for these vehicles and we can have these vehicles be accessible to a broader swath of people in Nevada, I think that's when things will really take off. And so I think that's another design question for policymakers is how can we assist in the secondary market as well, so that more working families can have access to these vehicles. So no silver bullet delivered on that one, but certainly flagging that's a very important topic for us.
Greg, you have something to add?
Yeah, and not at all minimizing the fiscal issues, but I think there is something to be said for the socialization aspect of electrification. The state climate strategy looks at options for the state leading by example, and there's an acknowledged not only maybe fiscal and or concerns about operation, but just lack of familiarity with electric vehicles that frankly the leaders in government and industry can start to set an example. I mean, when you look at the planning horizons for our budget cycles on a 2-year, they don't necessarily lend themselves for, well, if we started electrifying more, what would the budget savings be over a 5-10 year period for public fleets converting to electrification, and looking at longer planning horizons, and that would I'm thinking that's going to be an important part of socializing EVs throughout Nevada.
Thanks, Greg. So recognizing we have about 3 minutes left, I want to ask a question that's really kind of talk about the climate strategy a little bit, but particularly that connection and the environmental justice space. So when we crafted the climate strategy, just so everybody's aware, for the state, we looked at policies that had been adopted in other states, and then we characterized them around 4 metrics, one of which was social justice, with the intention of basically creating a pathway under which or upon which the state could basically shape these policies so that they would address issues that are important to Nevada and would be specific to us. So on that climate justice thrust, I wonder if each of you could just take a minute and just share what you think share your perspectives on the opportunities and the challenges in this EV space around social justice. And I'm going to start with you, Sandra.
Okay, sure. Yeah, as I mentioned in my intro, NDOT views these issues as all kind of in one. And so in the climate strategy, there was more attention paid to vehicle emission reduction strategies. And that's primarily because we have more information and data on that. But you'll see in some of the other sections of the report talking about, transportation sustainability as a whole. And that's really the opportunity to address some of these social justice issues. Making sure, people in the state of Nevada and hopefully the rest of the country have options when they look at how they're going to move around. And that starts from, land use, having homes close to businesses and jobs, but also a variety of transportation options, whether it's active transportation or transit or personally owned vehicles that may be of a variety of size and options. We want to look at the opportunity, if we are going to incentivize purchase of electric vehicles, to really look at that opportunity for those underrepresented communities to have shared vehicles. Not everyone needs a vehicle every single day. So the opportunity for folks living in apartments to be able to share an EV as needed for trips to the grocery store or whatever. So, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring up again the funding issue. I know that was the prior question, but looking at how do we create a fund source for transportation that's not reliant on burning of fossil fuels. So that's a big issue. And I know I've talked more than probably my 1 minute, so I'll let anyone else jump in if there's any time.
So I have to say we are at time, but I actually think you did a really nice job characterizing that. And really, I think all of us would have said something quite similar. So thank you for that. And I'd like to thank our panelists, virtual clap from afar for everybody for the discussion. And thank you, Sue.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen, David, Greg, Sandra. You couldn't see our side chat on this, but we were all thrilled at the EC for how much you jumped in and engaged on the issues, and I think really provided some great insights and ideas to move forward on. So thank you all. We're thrilled to start working with you back in March and haven't regretted it from a minute. It's been fantastic. So looking forward to all that we're going to do in the months ahead. So thank you all very much. Appreciate it. And stick around for more. Chance to jump into the fishbowl if you're around for that. We're going to go ahead and switch from what's going on in the executive branch and the agencies to hear from a couple of really key players in the Nevada legislature. So we know movement forward is going to take a lot of different actors. So we're really thrilled to be able to hear from 2 Las Vegas-based champions from the legislature. We're going to hear from them in the next session. And then just a heads up that when we get to our fishbowl conversation this afternoon, we're going to be joined by Senator Chris Brooks, who's another great champion on this topic. So I'm going to do 2 really quick introductions, and then I'm going to ask each of our speakers to go ahead and then share their thoughts. So let me start with the first one here. We're going to hear first from Assemblyman Howard Watts. His efforts have included helping promote the use of heavy-duty electric vehicles. We're going to hear from him, get a little bit more on his insights, maybe what he's looking forward to most in the next session. And then, just so you know who he is when he shows up on the screen, we'll hear from Assemblyman Tom Roberts. He's got a distinguished career in law enforcement prior to joining the legislature, and he currently serves as the Republican co-deputy leader. So really thrilled to have you with us, Assemblyman Roberts. So I'll turn it over to both of you, and please sit back and hear some good ideas here.
Great. Thank you, Sue. Glad to be here. I'm really excited about the future for electric vehicles. As the last panel discussed, this is the direction that our state is moving in with the passage of laws and Governor Sisolak setting goals for us to fight climate change. I think that especially within the Democratic Party, that's something that we are very excited about accelerating our leadership on. As has already probably been brought up, the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions in our state is from the transportation sector. So the electrification of transportation presents a huge opportunity for us to meet our climate goals. And, we are looking at benchmarks in 2025, 2030, and 2050. And we need to begin to accelerate that transition now in order to meet our goals. So, I think that whatever we can do in the legislative branch to move that policy forward is going to be beneficial. Electric vehicles did come up a little bit last session in the Committee on Growth and Infrastructure, on which both myself and Assemblyman Roberts serve on. And I expect that we're going to see even more policies to address that in the upcoming legislative session in 2021. But the other thing I'd note is that we had in our recent special session a joint resolution that declared racism a public health crisis. And I believe earlier panelists have discussed some of the public health impacts that vehicle pollution have on our community. And I think that by addressing electrification and looking at some of the equity issues that have been brought up, we have the opportunity to follow through with action to address both health and lung disease, which I think everyone is more aware of now than ever, as well as to tackle the public health crises that are tied to racial inequity. But while those are some of the things that I think really appeal to members of the Democratic Party, I think there's a lot of room for bipartisan agreement when it comes to electric vehicle policy. Nevada has been hit particularly hard by the latest economic downturn. I think promoting the diversification of our economy, creating green jobs, kind of doubling down on the economic strengths and position that we have is a huge opportunity to help us deal with unemployment, to deal with some of the budget issues that we've had. And I think that enjoys wide bipartisan support. For just one example, in the last legislative session, myself, Assemblyman Roberts, and actually every single member of the legislature voted to increase our state's renewable portfolio standard to 50% by 2030. And all of us may have had different reasons or priorities when we voted for that, but we all came together in supporting that policy. And I think that advancing the state's clean economy and electric vehicle economy is an opportunity for us to do just that as well. So, I think I'm working on some policies to address vehicle emissions, and I'm hopeful that we can also use that to help support the adoption of electric vehicles. I know that there are some other policies that have been proposed. Incentives were brought up before. I know that there's a bill out there to allow electric vehicles to use our HOV lanes. I think there's some ideas of creative incentives that aren't just financial that the state can undertake to help promote the adoption of electric vehicles. And then deployment of charging, I think, is another key issue that the legislature is going to be looking at, and how we can support that. Because once we make sure that charging is available, that gets people's concern about electric vehicle range down. And I think it makes people take a harder look at electric vehicles as their next choices. So I think by focusing on infrastructure and making the vehicles accessible and just educating the community, we can help advance vehicle transportation electrification in the next legislative session.
Great. Thank you so much, Assemblyman Watts. You clearly have a full plate of things that you're heading into, so appreciate your time. We're going to go ahead and hear from your colleague, Assemblyman Roberts, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I appreciate, I think Howard pretty much covered a lot of the issues that we looked at last session and what we're going to look at this next session. And, and I'm going to focus a little more on if you're wanting to push policy forward, this seems to be historically that it wasn't a very Republican issue. But there's people like myself and others in the legislature that really believe that EVs, are essential to reducing, greenhouse gases and making our environment, much more cleaner. And to Howard's point, it makes economic sense as productivity and production of these vehicles, they become more affordable. It becomes more appealing to the average citizen in our constituency. And I'll give you an example of a study in 2019 that was done by Climate Nexus that basically 77% of the people that were polled viewed EVs positively. 84% of those were Democrats, 75% independents, and 70% were Republicans. So you can see that it is a definite bipartisan issue that people are starting to embrace EVs, and that goes across party lines, which is why I believe that you'll see more Republican legislators get on board with these because their constituency wants them. That's because, as we mentioned earlier, people realize that EVs are good for the environment. And manufacturers are producing very nice vehicles now. They have great performance, better distance. Obviously, we have infrastructure issues that we need to address, but I believe that we're moving in the right direction for those. And they're starting to become priced so that the average person can actually, afford an EV, and so I think the more that we move in that direction, the more bipartisan support that you can get. For Republicans, it is about less burden on taxpayers, less burden on government. And so that anytime that you can find a policy that hits those two, I think you're gonna pull some bipartisan support for them. Another thing that that survey found was that appealed across party lines, as I just talked about a little bit, was tax credits. Those people surveyed, 78% of the Democrats supported it, 71% of independents and Republicans supported tax credits, which is why I believe that from the federal level, you still see bipartisan support to continue those. And so I believe that any kind of legislation that we could put forward in the state would be beneficial to that. And so, looking forward for what's coming in the next session, I would leave you with four things that would be appealing to bipartisan. Is if you can come up with any kind of tax incentive for private business to build EV infrastructure, I think you would hit a home run with members of my party. Incentive for manufacturers for EVs, for parts to move to the state so that they could diversify our economy, just as we saw with Tesla and the Gigafactory up north. I think anything like that would be a positive move for us. Anytime that EVs can reduce a budget, from converting from electricity to gas, even if it's long-term, if you can present that kind of argument, I believe you could get bipartisan support. And the last thing that is anything that would reduce any government barriers that would make EVs and pushing EVs, when we talked a little bit about it earlier with infrastructure and, and any kind of regulation that we could help reduce those, I think we would be on board all day. So moving forward, it's definitely a bipartisan issue. Just keep in mind that, leadership is disappointing your people at a rate that they can absorb. And so some of us can get kind of out there, but then some of our members can't. So keep that in the back of your mind when you're pushing policy. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's fantastic. And I'm so glad that you could speak to this issue from a bipartisan perspective. It's certainly been our experience, across all the states we've been working with, that this issue appeals to folks for many different reasons. So thank you for your leadership on that. And I love having the script for all of us to work from. I think there's some great ideas that we can move forward with in this coming session. So look forward to working with both of you, Assemblyman Roberts, Assemblyman Watts. Appreciate your time. I know it's a busy season, so we're going to end there, but thanks very much for joining us and for being part of the boot camp. Appreciate it. So we're going to turn now to our fireside chat. I'm going to go ahead and just give you a little bit of a preview of who's going to be joining us, but I'm going to turn things over to Brent Prohaska. He's going to lead us in a discussion with 5 leading industry players. They're going to share with you where they see the market and where they see policy going forward, and give us all some additional ideas on how we can work with Nevada on electrification. Thanks, Ben.
Great. Hi, everyone. Great to be back. And I think I'm just going to start by, we'll do a brief background on what we're trying to accomplish here with the fireside chat. I will start by saying that I'm excited to have such a powerhouse of folks joining us. It represents a broad cross section of the space. We oftentimes just focus on specific pieces or think about electric vehicles as just a light duty vehicle, but I think that there's so much more, and I think that's shown up in the last 2 sessions. But the idea is to some degree to start off and let each of the folks joining today do a quick introduction, talk about their role at the organization or company that they work for, and then we'll get into a little bit of a round robin of Q&A. But I'm really excited for this panel and to get some direct perspective from the industry. So why don't I go ahead and start by introducing and letting Jamie actually, but Jamie Hall, if you could take a second and just introduce yourself and talk about your role at General Motors. And I think we are going to share your slides as well. And Jamie, I'm not sure if you have your video on yet. Oh, there we go. Perfect. It's amazing when technology works.
Okay, and you can go ahead to the next slide, and then actually go to this one's good. Okay, so thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Electrification Coalition for pulling this together. My name is Jamie Hall. I'm on the policy team at GM. I focus primarily on electrification, so very relevant for me and really exciting. GM believes the future is all electric, and this vision and what it means for the auto industry, I think is definitely a reason to be excited. It's something that means a lot to me personally. It's fortunately where I get to spend most of my time. And it's more than just words. We're putting a lot of resources behind this. And so you can see a snapshot on this slide. We've recently announced a significant increase in investment in electrification and automation, bringing the total to $27 billion by 2025. We're now going to be investing more in EV and AV programs than we are in other technologies. So I think this is really a turning point for a major OEM like General Motors. And we plan to launch 30 new electric vehicles by 2025. So you're going to see more vehicles, more variety, more price points, and just sort of all around better product. And I think this came up in some of the earlier sessions. It's really, we're getting to the point where there are going to be things that meet everyone's needs. So if you can go to the next slide, I just wanted to give a few concrete examples of these investments. I actually got to see these vehicles earlier this year at the GM Design Dome in Detroit just before COVID, and Ben, I think you did as well. Hopefully you're all familiar with the Chevrolet Bolt EV. It gets over 250 miles on a charge. It's at a mass market price point. There will be updates coming next year as well as a new version, so that's something to look forward to. But we're really branching out beyond that vehicle at this point. Earlier this year, we announced the Cadillac Lyriq EV, which is the vehicle here in the middle. Beautiful luxury vehicle, long range, a lot of cutting edge technology. I think there's a real reason to be excited. I definitely was a big fan of this vehicle when I saw it back in March. And as I think we heard in the last session, we've recently unveiled the Hummer EV and doing a big push on that. If you haven't checked out any of the videos, this thing is just awesome. And so I encourage you to take a look. And if you are so inclined, feel free to put down a reservation. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, but I thought it'd be helpful to show some actual, concrete sense of what's coming. I think it shows that you're going to see more and more vehicles in more segments with more capability and broader appeal. This is exciting, but these vehicles alone are not enough. As we look ahead to an all-electric future, we need to all work together, and I think that's why we're here today. So again, I want to thank you for convening this. A lot of what I heard in the last couple of sessions was exactly the sorts of things I wanted to hear around infrastructure and incentives and how do we move this along. So thanks again. Happy to take part in the discussion.
Great. Well, next one, I move to Marie, and you could talk a little bit about your role at NV Energy.
Let me quickly unmute myself. So Marie Steele, I'm Electrification Director at NV Energy. It's a newly created position to ensure that NV Energy is doing all that we can around electrification, not just in transportation, but beneficial electrification in general. But NV Energy's had a long history in electric vehicles, starting with TOU rates in 2007 through programs all the way through now, and are very thankful for the different partnerships on the call. It was great to hear the state folks working with the Governor's Office of Energy on the electric highway, NDEP on the school buses, and really want to give a shout out to Rudy before for the Clean Buses for Healthy Niños. It's really a testament to advocacy, to policy, to implementation, to getting school buses on the road. So, NV Energy, we have existing programs, and we're looking forward to the future of the many conversations on how we expand our role to make sure that we're using electrification not just for environmental benefits, but for economic benefits and health benefits, and making sure that we're hitting all equitable solutions as we approach all of our new programs. And so we're really excited to move forward with our different partnerships moving forward next year.
Great. Why don't we go next to Vic? And you've done some great work on the background. It's nice to see Amply's studio so well thought out.
Yeah, thank you. Vic Xiao here from Amply Power. A great deal of thanks to my kids who work up the background that you're seeing in front of you. So Amply deploys charging infrastructure much like data centers deploy server blades, a lot of them at a time, high degree of reliability, robustness, efficiency at the lowest cost possible. So our customers are transit agencies that operate electric buses, truck operators that are contemplating transitioning to electric, but with the expectation of mission critical availability on charging and on infrastructure. I mean, these vehicles, produce revenues for them. So it's just got to be able to refuel when they expect it to. So by this point, we've surveyed hundreds of fleet operators all across the country, not just in California, when I'm calling in from, but we have projects from coast to coast at this point. And what we hear again and again on infrastructure boils down to three things. First of all, unlike diesel, pricing on electricity is wildly volatile. I mean, diesel goes up or down by 25% in a year or something, whereas electricity pricing could be up or down by 400% in a single day. And that's particularly the case in California. And so having budgetability and forecastability on fueling cost next week, next month, next year is on top of mind for a lot of fleet operators. I mean, aside from drivers, fuel is 67% of the operating cost, right? Secondly, this is not a 5-minute fuel up scenario anymore. This is going to take several hours, regardless of how fast or slow perhaps the chargers are. So it means that the fleet operator needs to schedule the charging into their daily workflows. And finally, the fleet operators are being asked to make an investment, and therefore they have an expectation that this equipment is going to work into the future, that there's compatibility, there is future proofing on the various plugs or pantograph charging or wireless charging standards. So those are the three problems that Ampli is trying to solve for the industry, and we bundled it all into a scenario where we're charging the customers by electricity dispensed or fuel dispensed, miles driven, if you will. I'll stop there.
Great. Why don't we go next to Sarah, and if you could talk a little bit about EVgo.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sarah Raffleson. I lead the public policy team at EVgo. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are the largest provider of public fast charging in the country. We have about 800 locations in 34 states and 66 metropolitan markets. And EVgo works with OEMs like Nissan and also GM. You may have seen an announcement earlier this summer that EVgo entered into a partnership with General Motors, whereby we will be tripling our fast charging network in the coming years. So always happy to be on a panel with Jamie so we can talk more about that partnership. And then, of course, and I heard this mentioned in earlier discussions as well, rideshare and car sharing is an increasingly important part of EVgo's portfolio as well as other fleets. So really interested in talking about how we can create market conditions in Nevada that would aid in expansion for infrastructure. Thanks for having me.
Great. And if you haven't seen the most recent GM ad, there's somewhere about 15 seconds in, you'll get to see the partnership fully displayed in the commercial. So
I did send that video to my parents. They were excited about it first because they thought I was going to be in the video, but I had to tell them and explain that, no, it's just our charger, but nonetheless, quite exciting.
Well, things to aspire to in the partnership with GM, clearly. So with that, I'll pass it to Thad, and if you could share a little bit about your work with Tesla.
Yeah, thank you. Thad Karowski, I'm a senior policy manager here at Tesla. Appreciate being invited to the discussion. Since its founding in 2003, Tesla has really expanded our electrification efforts pretty broadly. I think we're the only company represented here that plays in the totality of the electrification value chain, from producing and installing solar photovoltaics to energy storage, our network of charging stations, of course, and our vehicles. Our Gigafactory is located in Sparks, Nevada, just outside of Reno, and has helped create more than 10,000 jobs on that site. In meeting our staffing needs, we've developed some of the most advanced workforce development programs in the country. One of our programs focuses on graduating Nevada high school seniors, and that program has grown over the 3 years that it's been in place to reach 50% of the Title I high schools in the state. When it comes to what I am most excited about for EVs in Nevada, I really find the perspective of the Electrification Coalition compelling, frankly. Nevada imports 100% of its liquid fuel supply chain from other places. The result of that really being that Nevada exports billions of dollars annually in gasoline revenue to support jobs outside of Nevada. So when you consider what a future looks like when Nevada fully embraces electrification, economic benefits are important, really important, in addition to the health and climate related benefits. So imagine Nevada accelerating EV adoption and what that could mean for the local economy there. The faster the transition, the more the electrification, the greater the opportunity for investment, the more dollars stay local, growing that local electricity-based economy. Immediately, Nevada is really well positioned to expand in a variety of different sectors. And I really think that there's almost nothing that doesn't make sense about accelerating electrification in Nevada. So again, appreciate being here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for the quick introductions. So we'll jump a little bit into round robin Q&A. And I think in this, just to kind of kick things off, what are some of the challenges that are, you're most concerned about, and what role can the state play in addressing some of those policies? And maybe just to start, Jamie, if you wanted to jump in. Oh, awesome.
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I don't know something weird happened to your camera, but it's okay. We can hear you perfectly.
Here,
Go
let
for
me-
it.
There.
There it is.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, the sticker that usually covers it, it flipped back in front. So sorry about that.
No worries.
So in terms of challenges, I mean, we really need to think about how to make this a no-brainer for the customer. And so first and foremost, the most obvious thing that we as an automaker can do is keep working to bring the cost down. There is definitely room for policy and incentives to sort of accelerate things near term. And I know we've talked a little bit about this in earlier panels, particularly for the two OEMs you have on the panel today, Tesla and GM. We've both hit the cap on the federal tax credit. So there's not a lot of external help to kind of help customers make that value proposition pencil. We can look at other ways to help HOV lane access, things like that, you know, can help nudge people. But the other big obvious thing, and I think some of the other speakers can go into more detail on this, is charging infrastructure. We've got to get to the point where no one has to worry about how they're going to charge their vehicle or how much it's going to cost. And I think there's a lot of room for state engagement here on, you know, utility programs and rate design and direct investment and whatnot. We've been able to kind of handle the low-hanging fruit up until now, which, you know, this market is largely made up of people, the early adopters of EVs. They own their own homes. They have a garage. It's not such a stretch for them to plug in. But as we look to broaden the market, we really got to make sure people can go wherever they want, and those without access to home charging have a way to make this work. So those are kind of the two things that I think about most.
Thad, maybe just to take it to you, what about just really narrowing down to Nevada as an option, right? You mentioned the idea that it's, you know, Nevada couldn't make more sense for transportation electrification. So what kind of policy options would really work for Nevada, and should everybody on this webinar be thinking about?
So kind of coming back to the initial point on the economic potential, you know, I find some of the biggest challenges to electrification start really at a macro level about understanding what that potential economic benefit is. You know, the climate change, renewable energy, electric vehicles, though Assemblyman Roberts said just now otherwise, and I hope that's the case, but those can sometimes unfortunately become partisan issues. And so the macro challenge, in my opinion, is in trying to help state leaders really understand that bipartisan opportunity around the economic development that can happen in Nevada and the resulting energy security. Nevada benefits from an abundance of environmental advocates. You know, this isn't to be critical of the local advocacy groups. I think that many of them are doing really great work, and frankly, I work with a lot of them. But for a place like Nevada, where there's so much economic benefit to gain, a diversity of opinions and coming to advocacy efforts really through the lens of energy security, in my opinion, resonates really broadly with people across the aisle and local leaders as well. Individual policies may remain somewhat more partisan, but at the end, if the end goal is really understood of where you're trying to go, that can serve as a positive purpose to bridge some of the philosophical divides on individual policy initiatives. And I think there are a number of challenges. I agree with Jamie on all fronts, more of a micro level. You know, adoption of EV-ready building codes, infrastructure planning and rate design, we've heard a little bit about today, preparing for a future workforce, and kind of there's a lengthy list there. And when it really, what it really comes down to, in my opinion, in near-term opportunities is, you know, accessibility for Nevadans. There was discussion about the adoption of the clean fuels, or sorry, clean car standards earlier today, one that incents manufacturers to deliver the vehicles to the state of Nevada to provide greater customer choice. I think there's potential there. Funding acceleration. So we've heard several participants really note that there are budget limitations, understandably, that could otherwise be used towards market transformation. And one of those important policy tools that I would encourage the state to consider is looking at a clean fuels policy. It's a relatively low cost policy adoption from the state, and it can further create incentives to the auto industry, to charging providers, to utilities, to play a growing investment role in Nevada. And with those funds that are generated really from private credit trading market opportunities. So again, relatively low cost to the state. And the other thing that I think that Nevada should really consider is medium and heavy duty sector transition, which we've also heard a little bit about, but I'd encourage them to state leadership to move towards the 15 state MOU on medium and heavy duty electrification. And along with that, I think one of the hurdles is getting appropriate funding to the agencies that would be adopting those particular rules, so that they have enough manpower to actually provide the policy transition that Nevada could benefit from.
Great. And for those who aren't familiar with the Clean Fuel Standard, it's oftentimes referred to as the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And so California is one of the pioneering places for that. But there's a lot of interest on that being a policy mechanism that could exist across the country that can help generate a lot of revenue. And I think you'd probably find a lot of advocates really seeing that as a really good opportunity in addition to some of the other stuff that the state of Nevada has already started to push forward. But maybe taking, this is a terrible pun, but I can't help myself, taking the wheels off and moving to the infrastructure side. Marie, what do you think is happening on the infrastructure deployment so far in Nevada, and what are some of the policy levers that you think need more attention from your perspective?
Sure. So, I mean, we've had infrastructure programs to date that have, been small given the demand in vehicles at the time. So, a program in 2013 and a program created in 2017 through legislation maybe doesn't meet the moment that we're at today, the true inflection point. So, there's conversations in the Public Utilities Commission around electric vehicle infrastructure deployment. So there's a lot of conversations going on around what that really expanded role of the utility and also just intentional electric vehicle infrastructure deployment so that it supports underrepresented communities. It also meets the needs of public charging infrastructure so that people feel comfortable going electric. We had a recent electric vehicle survey that says 24% of Nevadans are likely going to have their next electric vehicle be, or next vehicle be electric, sorry, and then 28% are neutral. But if you think about that, that's 50% of Nevadans that are actively thinking about going electric. And then when you think about it otherwise from there, sorry, I got to pull up my data, 47% of them need a charger at home to feel comfortable to do that. And then also another 47% are looking for public infrastructure. So the need is really here for more holistic planning on more intentional charging infrastructure than probably what we're doing now. And then also to talk about maybe quickly what Dr. Avert said before is it's not just vehicles. When we think about transportation as a whole, it's rail, it's boats, it's trains, so there's many more things to think about when we think about electrifying the entire transportation sector that we need to plan for as a community and as a state.
So when you talk about expanding infrastructure, and I won't use I don't have the access to the facts, but I think EVgo is a good example of helping create those, one of the largest DC fast charging networks in the country. And so Sarah, maybe a little bit on your perspective on, what are some of those leading policies that Nevada could be considering that are going to help connect the dots and get people to plug in?
Sure. So I would say as we look at market expansion, we look at really a number of factors. So one thing is rate design. So I just want to give some kudos to Marie, maybe first to start, because NV Energy on the commercial EV rate side was really one of the earlier utilities to adopt a long-term commercial EV rate. And honestly, as we speak to utilities and public utilities commissions across the country, we share that as a best practice, as one that they should look at in their own adoption. So I would say rate design is really critical. Anything that gets more cars on the road, whether that's a clean fuel standard or anything that incents vehicles and BEV density is really important. It's important for us as a charging provider to be deploying, chargers where there's expected to be or there is demand on the vehicle side, whether that's personal use vehicles or some of the fleets that have been spoken of. And I know Rudy from SPEA mentioned also ride sharing, car sharing. Again, that's something that we look at as well. I think the main message I would have for us as we look at a place like Nevada, and honestly, this is something that we see across the country, is as we design DC fast charging programs, we need to think beyond DC fast charging as only a corridor use case. DC fast charging, to Jamie's point, is very important as well as an urban use case for those who don't have access to charging at home. So I would say corridor only programs may limit installing DC fast charging in the areas that have a higher pollution impact, as well as those who perhaps live in multi-unit dwellings. So we really need to focus on having more DC fast charging programs in the population centers. And I see that there's been a lot of talk about some best practices from California, but I would say on the infrastructure program side, one of the best programs that we see across the country is in Colorado. Charge Ahead Colorado solicitations about 3 times a year for different charging infrastructure. And additionally, they also put out a solicitation recently for DC fast charging in urban plazas, wanting DC fast charging to serve apartment dwellers and rideshare dwellers as well. So I would point to them as a best practice in program design, as different state agencies, if there's a magic wand waved and all of a sudden there's more funding availability that comes from federal government or what have you. But I would say that that would be a really great program design to look at.
And if people are interested in rate design and, Colorado, Chris Nelder, who's going to be coming on next, is one of the big experts on rate design. And I think you'll wish it's almost like you'll learn too much, but this is a good opportunity to learn a lot about rate design. So, I think fleets continue to represent a really important opportunity. I think they're a great demonstration and the value proposition associated with EVs. But Vic, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, the role you all play and what policy mechanisms can help move fleets faster.
Yeah, well, for fleets, what is interesting about fleets is that a lot of the pilot projects were started, 5 years ago. In a transit sector, a lot of transit bus pilots, 2 of them at a time, 5 at a time, 10 at a time, were started a number of years ago. And at this point in time, a lot of the transit agencies are ready to go full scale, 100% electrification. We're starting to see these kinds of solicitations coming out. Amply, we signed up with Anaheim Transit for a deployment in one location, 46 fast chargers for 100% electrification down in Anaheim, California. So we're starting to see these types of requests come out. What I find interesting, and for myself, prior to Amply, I've been an energy storage and solar guy for the past 10 years. What I find interesting about electrification is that with solar energy storage, there's a small handful of states, right? And we could all name them on our fingers. It's California, Massachusetts, New York, Hawaii, that seems to get into these kinds of renewable projects before the rest of the country, taking a long time. What I find interesting, however, with electrification is that we're already dealing with 20 some odd states all across the country on their electrification efforts, whether it's buses, trucks, ports, and cities, county fleets, and so forth. So I find this to be incredibly interesting, and it just speaks to a much larger opportunity at hand. What I will say one word about Nevada, and that is it's got a number of characteristics that is not so common in California, really. First, there are it gets cold in Nevada, and cold temperature has some unique characteristics associated with it. Shorter range when we deal with a lot of mission critical vehicles. So shorter range impacting the lithium-ion battery packs, cabin heating requirements. All of that plays a role in the expected range of the vehicle. And secondly, Nevada has a number of highway thoroughfares, like Highway 80, Highway 15, and it presents an incredible opportunity for charging along those highway locations to transport goods, across the country. So anyway, I just thought I would mention that. I think there's some unique characteristics and opportunities in Nevada.
So Just a reminder to folks that are following along at home, feel free to throw some questions in the chat. This is a great opportunity to ask, a nationwide community of experts really that's represented on this. So I guess I'm interested in the idea of, what role do you think the change in administration is going to play on the policy framework and policy opportunities? And so maybe starting with you, Sarah, looking at the idea of how does that affect infrastructure in Nevada? How do you think that might play out in terms of nationwide infrastructure opportunities?
Sure. Well, I think, there's certainly much conversation and excitement around Biden's goals for transportation electrification. And I think it's to be seen as to what can happen. But obviously, there's some very lofty goals in terms of charging infrastructure that we're certainly very excited about and involved in through Zeta, as I know Thad's team is as well, and perhaps others that have been on the panels today. So we've been very active looking at not only just infrastructure, but also, again, to the point earlier I made about anything that could get more cars on the road, be it an extension of tax credits or something else. So really interested to see, what happens going into next year, and also just how the perhaps Senate race will determine the likelihood of that as well.
Any other folks want to jump in on just how they see the change in administration and the impact that it's going to have? And thinking about it from a Nevada context is always good. Marie, I see you unmuting. Are you jumping in?
Right. Dinged on the buzzer. I think additional money for infrastructure coming to the state will really helpful. As Director Bobzien highlighted, what the Office of Energy is doing. Helping build out those rural areas that maybe the investor-owned utility doesn't serve. So the more money, the better. I think is helpful, especially for Nevada being such a large state with such a rural area. That additional infrastructure funding would certainly help a state like ours.
Great. Well, I guess maybe change subject a little bit. I'm always thinking about the idea that as we start to transition, right? We've talked about light duty vehicles, but then we're starting to move into the idea that the technology is now finally catching up with all sectors, right? Battery costs are dropping, the ability to move the format into medium duty and heavy duty. And so I'm just interested in if any of you have started to think about policy options at the state level that are going to help move that as the sort of next great frontier freight. So anyone want to jump in on maybe freight Thad from Tesla's perspective? Jamie, I saw you on mute.
If Thad wants to go first, that works. Otherwise, I can just give.
You're faster on the draw on the mute, so go for it. It's the
All
new
right.
hand.
A lot of the policy needs and opportunities are the same. Here again, it's how are we going to solve the charging infrastructure challenges? How are we going to make sure that the electricity is affordable? And how are we going to help fleets kind of make the jump to a more certain technology with a higher upfront cost? The exciting thing about many fleets is that they're centrally fueled in depots, and that definitely creates some challenges on the infrastructure and energy side. But it also means that you have fewer larger customers that you're dealing with who tend to think more about total cost of ownership and take maybe a more sophisticated view of things. So I think it's exciting that the technology is coming. I think we've got to roll up our sleeves and do a lot of hard work on how we're going to make the infrastructure and the energy side of this work. But I also think that we have a sense of what it is that we have to do. And one policy that's come up throughout this discussion that I think could be particularly relevant in the medium heavy duty freight space is this clean fuel standard or low carbon fuel standard. It really is something that is worth looking at to support electrification overall. As Thad noted, it doesn't have a big budget hit on the state, but it can help make the economics work, and it can help us get the charging infrastructure out there. So that is something that we think could really accelerate things across the board.
Thad, I don't know if you wanted to offer any additional thoughts on just the medium heavy duty space.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything new, frankly, to offer. I think that the mention of the 15-state MOU is an interesting place to start. And as Jamie mentioned, that's a pretty broad group of vehicle categories, medium through heavy duty. And so getting into some of the detailed discussions around each particular use case and where those fit into reductions in emissions for Nevada in particular would be a place that I think would provide a lot of benefit in terms of providing an ability to lay down a roadmap for essentially a transition throughout those categories. And so I think that that's a good place to start.
Vic, go ahead.
Yeah, Ben, I'll jump in with a particular use case, perhaps, highlighting an example following in line with what Jamie was just speaking to, low carbon fuel standards. So under just using a project that we recently contracted with Anaheim Transit, in that scenario, what happened was the California LCFS program offered an additional incentive if the fleet is powered by zero carbon intensity, as zero as possible. So what it allowed us to do is to set up a 0.5 megawatt solar carport or busport in this case on top of these 46 buses. And it just so happens that in that case, the solar PPA would not have penciled without that extra boost from the zero carbon intensity LCFS program. So it made everything work. I mean, it tied everything together, solar, 100% electrification, all at the same time under a 20-year PPA contract framework. So I think Jamie's point is important. The LCFS program solves a lot of the challenges that we're seeing out there.
Well, and we always need like an acronym like thing like PPA, so Power Purchase Agreement, and LCFS, Low Carbon Fuel Standard. We'll have like a terms and relationship document for people. But I think in some ways it talks, it shares a lot about how the space is not just about the vehicles, but there's so many other sort of reinforcing policies that connect to the energy sector. And Marie, I see you again jumping off mute, so jump in.
I mean, I think when you really start to get into the medium and heavy duty space, it becomes a completely different conversation than light duty vehicles. You're getting into stationary storage and on-site generation, because integration of this load into the grid is critical. That's done right, we can do it at a much more responsible price point. But and also can use, if it follows the supply of renewable energy, it's even better for all ratepayers. So this medium and heavy duty conversation is a fascinating one, but it's definitely just past. Infrastructure becomes more things than just a charging station. It's storage and energy supply, and it gets extra wonky. So I'll see you at the Public Utilities Commission. But it's something to be incredibly mindful of, that if we're intentional on how we integrate this load into the grid, it really can benefit everybody at every level. So.
We are, this always happens where it's like, I feel like I would love to have like an hour and a half, because I think we're just scratching the surface, right? And if you try to do light duty, medium duty, heavy duty infrastructure, it's like, that's a pretty big lift. But we're kind of running towards the end of things. So maybe as a little bit of a lightning round, if you will. In addition to aspirations to Sarah to being in a GM commercial, someday plugging a EVgo charger into a GM vehicle, what are you thinking is this is kind of a question to everybody, but I'll start with you, Sarah. What is the most important next step for EVgo to think about for the state and to help accelerate EV adoption?
Yeah, so again, I would note that EVgo is actively assessing where we plan to expand in the coming years, and I think while the rate designs are certainly in place, we're really interested in seeing what types of DC fast programs will continue to develop. There's a really strong private sector business case when you tie that to the population centers in particular. So I think if we could wave a magic wand on a near-term step, it would be more DC fast charging programs that, again, just don't focus on corridors, but also focus on that urban use case.
Great. How about Thad? You want to take the next shot at that question?
Sure. So from a state level, and we heard it mentioned today, personally, I think I'd start with EV ready building codes kind of across the board to ready the infrastructure and the locations for the transition. And a close second, and Marie, I have not had a chance to look at these, so forgive me if this is not a problem with NB Energy. I'm not sure, but the close second would be to really streamline service interconnection processes. That doesn't necessarily need to be a something that's driven by policy, but certainly can be in some ways. And then at a business level, for Tesla, it's, we want to continue to innovate. Like Sarah mentioned, we're in the process of looking at infrastructure build out and over the next 2 years for our fast charging network. And lastly, probably of most importance for Tesla is to drive cost reductions in order to make vehicles more compelling across the board.
Great. Vic, would you like to take the same question next?
Yeah, I deal with medium and heavy duty vehicles, and for myself, for Amply, I think what we want to convey across the industry is that electrification is really an economic rationale. I mean, there's an economic foundation and basis to go from fossil fuel into electricity. It's just simply cheaper to fuel up using electricity than it does with the fossil fuel variety. And so I think that message is not currently out there, but at least certain early adopters, transit agencies are really understanding this economic viewpoint. And that's why across 20 some odd states, there are transit projects for electrification. But I would love for this message to be wider spread across the industry.
Yeah, and it's there's all kinds of examples. Like EVs are the only vehicle that are going to get cleaner over time, right? There's some of these things like the sort of message stuff where EVs are actually going to help reduce electricity costs, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But it's a truism. So maybe just to take that opportunity, move to you, Marie, and your thoughts on what are some of the next steps and how we're going to accelerate EVs.
Well, for the immediate next step is the utility has their electric vehicle program filing in February 1st. So hopefully we will see new programs in there that'll meet the immediate needs we're talking about. But a little bit more holistically, I'm excited to get to session and have this discussion amongst everybody to kind of meet this moment together. The utility is in step back to look at our programs and planning and how do we communicate. The state has our state climate strategy. Rudy was talking about a community assessment that do what Nevada does best and come together soon to talk about how we can really realize this together, transportation electrification, and make it happen. So.
Great. And then Jamie, if you're there, I saw you for a second. You get your last chance, but you have to chime in right now. Nope. All right. Well, with that, I want to thank this great panel. I'm really appreciate the thoughtful engagement. I think there's a lot of policy options. I hope that, in some ways, this is the first step to helping make Nevada an even bigger leader than it already is on transportation electrification. And so I'm going to pass it back to Sue to take us into lunch.
Great, thank you, Ben, and thanks so much for that conversation. Really excited to see the leadership in the private sector and great partners for Nevada going forward. We are at our lunch break. I'm sure you're all excited about that. We have about 25 minutes set aside for this. What I want to say before we officially break is that we're going to do a quick test of Menti. Oh, hooray. It looks like it is working. So we're going to bring that back at 1. If you want to come back a little bit early to participate in that. And then at 1:05 sharp, we will have Chris Nelder from our RMI come and share his wisdom on time of use rates and all things utility rate related. So please go ahead, sit back, relax, stretch, but come back for some more programming this afternoon. Thanks a lot. Well, hello again, everyone. Hope you're enjoying a little bit of a lunch break. We did want to give it a go with our Menti exercise and just take a few minutes to take a look at some of your answers to some of the questions we have. This is a great lead in to the conversations we're going to be having this afternoon, particularly as we reflect upon all that is happening already and hopefully happening in the future in Nevada. So first wanted to turn to the first slide that's up here. It looks like we've got some good ideas that folks have put forward. This was the question that was about what have you seen already in Nevada happening, and what kind of policy actions are you most proud of, I guess most excited about? And there's a nice full list of them there. Folks want to kind of take a look in. Might be some others that are adding in as we go. And we will capture these responses also and send them back out as part of the slide deck that we send back. So you don't need to be scribbling down too quickly on that front. We got a lot, the EV highway, the climate plan, lots of good things that we heard about earlier. So our next question was a little more forward-looking. What policy actions would you like to see Nevada take to continue accelerating EV adoption? You know, still a ways to go, some great starts, but if we're going to get to electrification everywhere, need to have a little more policy help. So it looks like actions around mobility. We heard Rudy talk about that a little bit. The ZEV standards, we know that there was a launch of the rulemaking yesterday formally. That's coming up strong. The medium heavy duty sector, we know that that's an emerging issue with a significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, and also an important element of equitable electrification, given that the highways and the depots are often located around low income and marginalized communities. So really important opportunities there. Some real cost savings for fleet operators as well. And it's clean truck rule. We heard a little bit of the mention of that. That's included in the climate strategy. So already at the start, some recognition on the part of that group and a part of the state that could be part of the future. All right, those are great responses. And I think this is the last one here. So what questions do you have with this morning's speakers that we didn't yet answer? So this is a little bit of a trick question, but we will try to get to these in the afternoon. So I guess what I'd say here is jot down those questions and be ready to offer them into the fishbowl, or present yourself into the fishbowl, and you can ask yourself a question or offer your remarks as part of that discussion. So thank you all. Thanks for your patience with the Menti. It's a fun way to kind of get everybody together and see what's on everybody's minds. So with that, we are going to kick off our next speaker. He is a repeat performer here at the EV Policy Bootcamp. Chris Nelder has joined us across the last few months to share his thoughts and his expertise, in particular in the area of utility regulation. We heard this come up earlier. Marie Steele from NV Energy talked about how time of use rates have been around, or at least in a pilot form, since 2007 in Nevada. So they've got some early experience with it. But Chris, we want you to tell us what more is out there, and what are the considerations that Nevada should take into account as it thinks about the really important role that rates and rate designs play. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Chris. go ahead and unmute and we'll get rolling.
It's always somebody, right? And this time it's me. Okay. Can you see my screen?
You can see it.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for your attention here for a few minutes. What I'm going to do today is share with you just a very quick overview of 6 major research reports that we've done over the past couple years. In like 10 minutes, I'm just going to give you some insights, but there's a lot of material here, so you may want to actually, pursue, take a look at the full reports later on. All right, so let's see if we can get this to advance. All right, so there are a couple of things that we think states really should get ready to do here in terms of advancing vehicle electrification. First of all, we really need to have more public charging stations out there. This is really important so that people who might live in, for example, an apartment building have confidence that there's going to be a charger when they need one. We need to enable utility investment in make-ready to accommodate EV chargers. And what that means is that the utility will probably need to increase the power supply coming into a facility to accommodate EV chargers, especially if there's a whole lot of them, like for a fleet facility or a bus depot or a workplace. And so the utility can provide the necessary infrastructure right up to the stub out of the charging station. And that's what we call the make ready, both on the customer side of the meter and on the utility side of the meter. We really need to enable more private sector investment. So with utilities providing make ready, that helps to bring down the capital cost. That's one way to enable more private sector investment, but there's a number of other issues that need to be cleared out of the way to really accelerate that. Utility rate design being one of them. We need to make it easier to connect chargers to the grid. So we need to streamline the process that electric vehicle service providers, what we call EVSPs, or the ones who operate networks of charging stations, need to go through in order to get connected to the utility grid, in order to get permits with the local ALJ, or sorry, the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, and to ensure compliance. And then we need to make sure that we're managing EV charging to benefit all utility customers. So one of the things that's really important to understand about charging infrastructure is that sort of everything is changing all the time. Right now, if you want to put in a charger at your home or your workplace, it's probably a 7 kilowatt charger. The level 2 is what we call this level. They can go up to 19 kilowatts. When you get into public and commercial high speed, what we call DCFC or direct current fast chargers, now we're in a whole different ballgame. It's 50 to 350 kilowatts. Right now, companies like Electrifying America are out there installing 150 kilowatt charging stations. So instead of taking 8 hours to charge up your vehicle, maybe you could do it in 15 or 20 minutes. And again, although home charging is dominant now, that's just a reflection of the early adopter stage of electric vehicle ownership. We really need to make sure that there are public charging stations and especially fast DCFC stations out there for everyone. And then when we get into trucks and so on, we're at a whole nother level again. So one of the key things that we need to do here is make sure that utilities are stepping up to provide their part of this infrastructure. We need to get them investing in make ready, but also they can invest in various kinds of incentives that will attract more private sector investment. But we make sure that we put guardrails around that, so it's a performance-based investment, so that the utility investment that gets passed on to all ratepayers is, in the regulatory language, used and useful. And we really want to make sure that where the private sector is probably not interested in investing, like high-speed public charging stations in low-income areas or other parts of sort of underserved markets, utilities might be the best entity to actually go ahead and own and operate those charging stations, because they can, they're sort of the definition of patient capital. So when we talk about what's really needed on the utility side, again, there's just a whole range here. If you're putting in, some more level 2 chargers at homes, you got to understand that the load of an EV, certainly, before we were all in lockdown, was about like adding a new house to the neighborhood. So if everybody in a neighborhood bought an EV and drove it all the time, the utility would have to upgrade the distribution transformer for that, serving that neighborhood. If you're doing the same thing for sort of workplace charging, where you might have 20, 30, or 50 chargers in a company parking lot, now you're also probably going to have to upgrade the feeder, that is the utility cable that comes in from the substation to the distribution transformer. Might have to upgrade some service panels. As we get into high-speed public charging depots, now we can be looking at sort of megawatts, not kilowatts of power requirements. Now we're also talking more utility investment in the make-ready. And then when we get into transit bus barns, fleet vehicles, and interstate truck stops, now we're getting into real power requirements, 50 to 30 to 40 megawatts. And now we're actually probably talking about building new power plants. So the utility has a very important role to play here at all different levels. There's a lot of uncertainty about how the electric vehicle landscape is going to evolve. We don't really know how many EVs there's going to be on the road by any given date in the future, or how many chargers we really should have per EV, or what power level they should have, or where they should be. What role will autonomous vehicles play and when? Because that could change the topology of charging requirements. How many vehicles do you actually need to make a solid business case for the private sector operators of these DC fast charging public stations to get to what we think that needs to be about a 30% utilization rate on those chargers for them to be profitable. So how many vehicles do you need to get there? And then how, of course, do we serve the folks who do not have single-family homes with a detached garage or a place where they can plug in reliably every night? And then how do we get more workplace charging going? So with all this uncertainty, how do you deal with it? My answer is pilots. Get your pilot started, gather data, analyze and share it, and then start scaling it up. It's pretty straightforward stuff. So enabling private sector investment is a very complex issue. Don't really have time to cover it in depth today, but again, I just want to emphasize that it's really critical for multi-unit dwellers and also on interstate corridors to have these high-speed public DCFC stations out there. And right now, most utility tariffs are structured such that it's not really profitable to own and operate these stations, again, until you get to that 30% utilization rate, which means we have to wait for the market to grow up quite a bit and for there to be a lot more EVs on the road. The biggest problem with these utility tariffs is what we call demand charges. And oftentimes these demand charges are applied in sort of a blind fashion because that's always been in the rate, and the rate was designed for a manufacturing facility, not for an EV charging station. So we're up against basically kind of the inertia of public utility rate design. And we need to address that. So we're going to have to come up with new tariffs that reduce the role of demand charges and create a better business case for DCFC owners and operators. And we've done extensive research on this, which again are reflected in the papers that we've published, and I'll show you those in a minute. But just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, this is an analysis we did for the Colorado Energy Office last summer in 2019, where we basically invented our own rate that would recover the same amount of revenue for the utility, in this case Xcel in Colorado, as their own tariff would recover for them. Only we did it in a slightly different way. And our tariff actually presented a very consistent cost per mile for the owner-operator of the DCFC charging network. So it's very predictable, and it allowed them to be profitable. That was not true for Xcel's proposed rate or for PG&E's rate, which is another one we analyzed in this paper that we had modified for comparison in this context. So, and that's true at all different levels of utilization. So this is a soluble problem, but we are going to have regulators or in some cases legislators that are very interested in making sure that we're creating a profitable business opportunity for these networks in order to encourage them to get these rates out there. The most recent paper that we published in January of this year was designed to understand where the costs are coming from in these networks And originally we thought, it was going to be around procurement. If we could just do it smarter or do it at scale or have less customization, we could bring those costs down. We discovered that was not really true. We also thought maybe requirements would be a big part of it. And all these things do contribute costs, but that was not the big problem either. The big problem was soft costs. And this has to do with how builders of these networks, these EVSPs, have to communicate with utilities, understand what the power requirements are, get easements, get through the complex codes and inconsistent permitting processes that they confront, especially if they're building a national network. This is, again, a very complex domain, but it's actually something that we already have seen starting 10 years ago in the solar sector, and various states and also the DOE developed programs that were designed to reduce these soft costs for solar. We're going to basically have to do the same thing here for EV charging infrastructure. So at the federal level, it would be really nice if we could, deal with some of these code harmonization and compliance issues, especially for ADA compliance. At the state level, we can certainly do a lot to streamline utility interconnection and permitting. And then at the municipal level, if we could just get building and planning departments for each little township to standardize around a single set of codes and permitting requirements and offer simple checklists, especially online now for required documentation, that would be super helpful. Don't really have time to delve into this today, but one of the key elements of doing good vehicle grid integration is to present a utility tariff that encourages people to charge off peak. And that's what we're showing here. You can really flatten the overall utility load curve by doing that. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip that one. So I just wanted to show you here our reports. Happy to share these links with you, and I encourage you to explore them and go deep on all these issues. Thank you.
Sorry, I was having a little bit of slowness on my mute and video button. So Chris, we had a policy discussion earlier where we were talking about some of the best options to drive out state policy and really accelerate adoption in Nevada. And you'll be very excited to know that rate design was at the top of the list for folks. So I was sort of saying, oh, well, if you want to hear about rate design, get ready. But I'm interested if you had any other things that you think Nevada should really be considering in the idea of moving the charging infrastructure network along, and just what are top things on your list if you were thinking about the Nevada context and the idea of them becoming a state leader or leader among states?
Well, getting those public DCFC stations built, especially along the major highway corridors that people transit as they go through the state, is a key element. And I know that New Mexico was one of the signatories to the Rev West MOU, so that would be a part of that objective as well. So we really do need to make sure that we're getting those public charging stations out there so that people feel confident that they're going to be able to get a charge when they need one. Another part of it is just to actually direct utilities to start really deliberately offering and being more aggressive about promoting their ability to invest in make ready, and to go ahead and socialize those costs as long as that's being done in a way that has good guardrails on it, and that's up to your regulator to establish. But we've also produced a little generic proposal for how that can be done in any state, so happy to share that as well.
All right, maybe as a last minute wrap up moment, can you give your opinion around the impacts of LCF on infrastructure development and how that is or isn't a good policy from your perspective?
LCFS?
Yep.
I mean, I frankly have just earlier today started getting my feet wet on that topic. It isn't something that we've researched before, but it is something we have to research now. It looks like it could be one way to get a revenue stream flowing that could be then applied to these kind of problems, which is not a terrible thing. But other than that, I don't really have an opinion on it.
Great. Well, we'll get to ask you next time. I'm sure as we have more of these, you can read in further. But it was one of the things that came up earlier, so I thought I'd throw it your way and threw a little curveball. Well, Chris, as always, I appreciate your time. If people aren't aware, Chris has quite a podcast that you can check out around energy issues, and certainly encouraged. And we, as always, look forward to working with you more. But at this point, I'm going to pass it back to Sue for the next session. So thanks as always for joining.
Thank you, Ben. And yeah, I encourage you all to check out my podcast at energytransitionshow.com.
He didn't pay me to do that, so just so we're clear.
No, I didn't even know you were going to do that, but you're very kind. Hi, Sue.
Well, hey, Chris, thanks again for being with us and condensing many reports and insights into a short amount of time. Thank you for sharing those links as well. And we'll have those on the slides for everyone who wants to go back and dig in further. So thank you, Chris. We're going to move on to a special session that we have at each of our boot camps, which is taking a step back and hearing from another state and learning from them about their experience and how it might apply to, in this case, Nevada. So when we thought this through, given both the proximity and the leadership that we've seen in the state of California, it really seemed like the right fit for this session. So we're really delighted to have with us Hannah Goldsmith. She's the lead advisor for the Zero Emission Vehicle Market Development portion of the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, otherwise known as GoBiz. I think that's one of the best acronyms out there. This is what she looks like, but you'll be seeing her in a minute. And we've asked her to just share a little bit more about some of the history, the lessons learned, how is coordination happening around the many activities that are taking place in California around transportation electrification, and just offer some of her insights, having worked on this for quite a while. So I'm going to hand things over to Hannah and let her share her insights with you.
Thank you so much, Sue. And I'm really pleased to be here. I've been listening in the whole day and have learned a lot too. And I can't say that California has all the answers. We've tried a number of things and have been successful in many and not so successful in others. So I'm happy to talk through a little bit of what's going on in California with you all. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just very briefly, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, or GoBiz, is a much broader office that basically services the whole suite of what businesses in California could need. And our mission is to bring business to California and keep it in California through any type of business. And then within this office, we have the Zero Emission Vehicle Market Development Team, which is a small, nimble team that focuses on zero emission vehicle policy and also assisting businesses in this space. Next slide, please. So as has been mentioned today, as many of you know, Governor Newsom signed in September a new executive order with zero emission vehicle targets for the passenger car market. 100% of in-state sales of new passenger cars and trucks will be zero emission by 2035, as well as targets for the medium and heavy duty sector for 2035 and 2045. And I'm going to move through some of these early slides a little bit faster because I know we're limited on time and I want to get into the lessons learned piece. So next slide, please. As many of you know, California struggles with our air quality, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley and in the South Coast, where we continually do not meet the clean air standards that are federal. So the opportunity to bring down emissions and continue to bring them down in the vehicle sector is really important to us and underlies a lot of the policy in this space, as well as fighting climate change. Next slide, please. So diving in a little bit into what we'll be doing to implement the recent executive order, GoBiz is tasked with leading a ZEV market development strategy intended to pull together all of the state agencies that work in the zero emission vehicle space and make sure that we're aligned on what our next steps forward will be to meet the targets, as well as to ensure that large scale and equitable market development in all our policies. So I've listed here on this slide some of the things in the executive order and the agencies that are responsible for doing that. So as I mentioned, we're sort of in charge of the strategy. We just accepted feedback on that through last Friday, and we'll be incorporating that feedback this week. So we're quite busy, and that is due by the end of January. So you can look for that coming from our office The Air Resources Board, as many of you know, is in charge of regulations and other strategies like funding programs to implement the executive order, so they'll continue working on those. The Energy Commission will be updating its charging infrastructure assessment to see what kinds of charging levels are necessary to meet the targets in the executive order. They had previously analyzed that through, I believe, 2030, but now obviously we have some deadlines beyond that that we need to figure out what our charging infrastructure targets should be. And then the Air Resources Board, as well as the Energy Commission and our Public Utilities Commission and other related agencies are all in charge of accelerating deployment of fueling and charging infrastructure, depending on what their authority and role is in this space. And there are other actions highlighted in the executive order that have to do with enhancing clean mobility options for all Californians, ensuring a just workforce transition, as well as continuing to reduce the carbon intensity of our fuels through the low carbon fuel standard and other policies that have been mentioned today. Next slide, please. So while we don't have charging infrastructure or hydrogen fueling infrastructure targets beyond 2025 in statute or executive order right now, I'm going to use these sort of interim targets to show the progress of California to date. And so we currently have a target of 5 million zero emission vehicles, including both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell through 2030. And then we have charging station target and DC fast charger sort of sub target within that, and a hydrogen station target. And those are both through 2025. Next slide, please. So here's sort of a market update on the vehicle side. I'm sure many of you have heard of Veloz. They track this through a great dashboard on their website for California, as well as for the USA for sales of zero emission vehicles. So through the third quarter of 2020, we're seeing about 9% passenger market share, and that includes battery electric, plug-in hybrid, and fuel cell vehicles. So that's up from 7.8% in 2019. And we're seeing an average increase of new zero emission vehicle registrations of 82% between 2007 and 2018. And then as you can see in those last few bullets, the number of models set to debut in both passenger vehicles as well as the medium heavy duty space continues to ramp up, which is really promising. Next slide, please. So here's another screenshot of a great tool that I will give a shout out to from the California Energy Commission. They recently launched this Tableau style tracker for looking at vehicle population, new ZEV sales, EV chargers, and hydrogen stations. And you can go in here and toggle around and look at where the state of California is in terms of meeting its targets for each of these areas. And you can see sort of that we still have quite a ways to go on the charging and hydrogen targets. We're not quite 30% of the way on either, except for DC fast chargers, which we're at about 54% of our 2025 goal. So we've been making progress, but we still have a long way to go. Next slide. And so we had a great fellow last term who did some work for us on modeling the investment that's going into EV charging infrastructure in California by different sort of type of funding. And this is not final, so please don't quote this, but I think it's just a good look at seeing how investments in California have changed and are increasing in the EV charging space. So you can see the private investment continues to increase over time, which is what we want to see as the state is investing in this market. Obviously, no state wants to continue to invest forever, and they want the private sector to take that over as time goes on. Next slide. So this is a bit dated, and I'll say that we certainly need to update this, but we were very interested early on as the pandemic began to understand the impact of COVID on the charging market space. And so you can see here there are two graphs. The one on the left is of 2020 and the one on the right is 2019. And we're looking at sort of the first 5 months of each year and how basically how many charging stations were installed during those months. And 2020, even with the pandemic, during the first 5 months of, or after, you can see the line there in March after the sort of shelter in place started, that the investment in charging installations and the amount of installations was still greater than in 2019. So we were pleased to see that. I'm not saying there's no impact from COVID. We know there is, and we still are going to have a lot to do to make up for slowdowns that have occurred in manufacturing and other areas. But this was a bit helpful to see what's going on in the charging market during those early months. Next slide. So I think this is my final sort of market update overview. Our office is particularly interested in the economic development and jobs piece, and we're doing a lot to better understand that. This great report came out from the LAEDC with some great numbers that I'll be quoting here. The first one actually is from our office in tracking exports in California, but through September of 2020, electric vehicles were California's #1 export. And then the next few bullets show that direct EV industry jobs have been increasing over time, and that the wages for those jobs are often better than sort of the average wage for other jobs in California. And also this unique trend in California that we're seeing of clustering, that there's sort of this geographically concentrated job growth and innovation going on in certain areas as businesses that rely on each other or are part of the same supply chain tend to locate nearby each other and increase the amount of jobs in certain areas, which has been really positive for California. Next slide, please. So now I want to move in a little bit to some kind of lessons learned. I think much of this will be echoing previous speakers from today. This first slide, I'm kind of honing in on the equity piece of things, which I know we heard about, but I just want to underscore what was said by the prior speaker about community engagement. One sort of quick example of this and something that we saw happen is, and I won't say which utility it was, but there was a utility in California that launched some charging stations through a pilot in a community that was an underserved community, and they didn't coordinate with the community before they did that. They didn't necessarily hire workers from that community, and we saw that those chargers quickly were sort of defaced, and there was a lot of feedback to the utility about, you know, you picked the wrong spot, these aren't helpful for us, sort of things like that. And I think that was a huge learning moment for that utility as well as for others on how important it is to engage the community and get their feedback on what your program looks like, where you're investing, how you're investing, who you're investing in. And I think that we've made a lot of great improvement in that area, but I just want to underscore how important that is. Also that in that same regard, one size does not fit all when we're looking at incentive or other programs. You have to look at the different needs of the community that you're going to be focusing on. And then likewise that it's important to consider equity and community engagement when you're developing incentive programs, as well as workforce or apprenticeship style programs, and also in your education and outreach. And that for education outreach, that might be, you know, what languages is your education outreach printed in? How many people do you hire who are actually from those communities and have people that they know and connections there to make their point come across better because they're trusted. So a few things like that I think are important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So another piece that California has been grappling with, and this is part of the goal of the strategy that we're developing, is what to do when your suite of policies has been created over time to deal with issues as they arise. And you can see on the left here, the only reason I'm laughing is because I'm sure you're seeing this chart and going, what the heck is that? So some of our stakeholders affectionately call this our spaghetti chart of all of the agencies and activities in California that relate to the zero emission vehicle space. So every single one of these bubbles represents either an agency or an action that has to do with the zero emission vehicle space. If you were a stakeholder and you're trying to get plugged into this, that looks like a nightmare, right? So I think as states are figuring out how to best work together and engage different agencies on different issues in this space, understanding what the overall goal is and how to organize that in a way that is comprehensible for stakeholders and for people to get involved with is extremely important. And that's something that we're now doing a little bit more after the fact. I'm glad we're doing it, but I think it's important if you can start to do it before you move into this many programs. That'll be helpful going forward. And then for related to this, I think it's important to recognize that there is no one policy that's going to move the zero emission vehicle market forward. You need a suite of different kinds of things. You need, regulations, incentives, things to address soft costs, which I'll talk about next. And incentives, I don't totally mean just funding. I think Assemblymember Watts mentioned this, that there can be creativity here in looking at, HOV lane access or other, preferential parking, things like that, that people like to see, but don't necessarily cost money. And then for funding source diversity, this is something that has been really important in California to continue to move the zero emission vehicle market forward. A lot of our funding for this market is from our cap and trade greenhouse gas reduction fund, which is not the most consistent pot of funds. But to help with that, we also have funding that goes to infrastructure from, and I think my time's up, so I'll just go super quickly. But anyway, I think it's important to look at, utility funding and low carbon fuel standard and things like that that can move funding forward in a different sort of way. I think I maybe only had like one slide. So I'll just briefly mention, and Chris mentioned this in the last one, but permitting and interconnection, we have a number of resources to help with that. And we track jurisdictions on whether they're streamlined for the permitting process. So happy to speak about that with anyone. I think that was my main last slide. And that's just to say there's so much we could talk about.
Hannah, thank you so much. Again, it's impossible to take all that California's done over the last decade or more, and cover it in 15 minutes. But I think what you offered was a really helpful set of insights. And unfortunately, I don't have any time for questions at this point, but I'm going to sum it up and see if you nod along with me in that. I liked how you ended with, there is no one policy. But as you consider, the array of policies, try and coordinate that up front. So you kind of have that vision as much as possible working together. So I think that's certainly good advice for Nevada and all states, and appreciate you sharing the many tools and approaches that you've put together. And I know we'll look forward to keeping in touch with you in the coming months as well.
Great, thank you so much for having me.
Excellent, thank you. And with that, this is actually a really great lead in to Andrew's presentation on our blueprint. We have looked at an array of policies and we've narrowed them down to some priority ones. So we're going to share those with you. You've heard, I think, all of them mentioned over the past few hours. So this will be some confirmation of what we see as some great options. So with that, really pleased to turn it over to Andrew to launch the blueprint section. And you want to go ahead, Andrew? I don't know if you're on mute. So Andrew has his slides up, but it looks like we can't see them in the in the fuel view. So maybe we can switch the view there. And Andrew, if you want to just start talking, we can go from there. We'll get your slides up for you.
Hi, can you hear me now?
There you go. Yep, you're on. That's a lead in. There you go.
Sorry about that. I checked it this morning, of course, and then of course I have issues. So here is the slideshow, and hopefully you can see this. Great. And we are, so thank you all. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about what we call our blueprint for policy action in Nevada. A lot of these items you have already heard throughout the day, which is really great from our point of view. So I'm going to run through a bunch of these, and then we are going to get into our fishbowl discussion. I know we have a number of great volunteers for that set up. And so this will be the lead into that. So this is a copy of a slide you saw earlier, but I bring it up again just to talk about all of the different things that are happening here in Nevada. There are some really, really great activities going on and numerous things that we should take advantage of, including to mining issues. Nevada is one of the few places with real lithium reserves. And as Admiral Greenert spoke about earlier, we need to make sure that we are not trading in oil dependency for critical minerals. This is just to give you all a scale of what we need to do. This has been talked about numerous times today. We do want to highlight that in the top chart, this includes a reduction in vehicle miles traveled and some of the land use issues. We've heard that come up, and that how electrification is not the cure-all for these items. So it's important to keep these things in mind, though we really aren't going to talk too much about that for these purposes. So here's just a few of the major items I'm going to run through. These, of course, should come as no surprise to all of you. And as I said, a number of them have been already talked about. But we're going to talk a little bit about light-duty vehicles, VW funding, some freight, transit and school buses, charging infrastructure, and then some access issues. So moving into the light-duty vehicles, here's just some facts about Nevada. I really like this bubble chart at the bottom. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to see, but this is EVs per 1,000 people on the x-axis, and the y-axis is DC fast chargers per 1,000 people. You can see California way up at the top right, but Nevada doing better than numerous other states that they are near, and so we really have a great opportunity to really capitalize. So moving into a few of the policy levers that we've talked about for light duty. So of course, finalizing the ZEV regulations as well as the LEV. We've heard a great deal about that and are excited to be involved in that over the course of the next year. Monetary and non-monetary incentives. Again, we've heard about the funding issues, the budget issues that are very real across the country. But hopefully things will start to turn around and the resources needed to really address this will become available. But there are non-monetary items that could be used as well, and we should really examine those going forward. Direct sales, dealership and consumer-facing education, ride and drives. These are really important. I think there's a lot of, for us that work on this issue on a regular basis, it's very easy to think that people have a very good understanding of EVs and such. And I think when you talk to the average person looking to purchase a vehicle, there's still a lot of questions, just how EVs go. For instance, someone asked me, will the car actually go fast enough to go on a highway? And I had to explain that my EV was actually faster than most of the gasoline cars out there. So we have our work cut out for us. A low carbon fuel standard, which can incentivize EVs as well as become a funding stream, extremely important. And we've heard that mentioned several times today, which I think kind of underlines its importance. Want to talk about the state and public fleets. This is really a way to help cut down on the pollution and to really move public funds into the EVs that we need. It also helps with visibility and education. EV first procurement policies are extremely important. We need to make innovative financing decisions so that public funds can get the best deals on EVs to expand their fleets. And then moving into VW funding, Nevada's done great with its first round. They were awarded nearly $25 million. We need to keep going with that. We can prioritize electric vehicles, maintain the 15% investment in EVSE, and continue to really use these funds to really be a down payment on what is needed. Moving into freight, here's just a quick snapshot. We've heard this numerous times today, the outsized impact that freight has on air pollution and oil usage, and we need to take advantage of the opportunities to help cut down on that. So a couple of the big things, we heard a few of these things discussed earlier. There is the medium heavy duty MOU, which just is a signal of the direction the state is going to go. Similar to some of the light and light duty things, we need financial and non-financial incentives, innovative financing models, owner-operator education, and make sure that people understand all the benefits of switching to this. And that goes for the state and local governments as well. The quicker we can switch those into electric vehicles, the better it will be, while investing in in the next generation of infrastructure that will be needed for that as well. Moving into the transit and school buses, there's a really big, this is a big sector in the state, and it's not the easiest nut to crack, but I think we heard several speakers talk about it earlier. We can't just think about personal cars. We need to think about mobility in general. Large segments of the population only have bus access to get to work and home and other appointments, and we should make those as clean as possible. Everyone getting around in transport should have the access to clean vehicles. Moving into some of the state opportunities for this. You can set EV bus goals, reducing the capital burden, taking advantage of federal programs. Hopefully there will be some additional with the new administration that will want to invest in these topics. And then we will, EV first policies. Again, more incentives are always needed. We need to make this shift. While keeping in mind, of course, the current budget allocations. So moving forward here, going into the infrastructure and rates, I don't want to copy everything that Chris has already said about this, but just to give a snapshot of where things are, I think we want to see more investment from all of the above, private and public, the utilities and the investor-owned utilities and the co-ops. This is going to take all of the above in order to get to these to solve these issues. And so just a few of the opportunities out there that we've heard about: ratepayer utilities, bulk purchase discounts, these electric corridors that I believe David spoke about earlier, and several other people mentioned. Let's capitalize on those. There's also Western Governors Association being led by Oregon with a focus on transportation issues. So we really, so there's really a lot of opportunities to move the ball forward on this. And then lastly, but not least, we do not want to see EV fees added to this, added to anything. We understand that there are, of course, significant highway and funding issues for transportation. EVs are such a small part of the market right now, and we don't want to put more headwind to adoption. So additional fees, will not help solve the transportation funding issue, but they could be a drag on EV adoption. So they need to be considered very carefully. And then lastly, direct sales, which I've mentioned. Very important. We hope to see that in the next legislative session. There is an exemption for Tesla at the moment, but I think we need a level playing field for all manufacturers and all folks that are selling vehicles in the state. So with that, that was our quick run through of our blueprint, which we will continue to edit in conjunction with many of you as we work towards a final product. It was really great to hear so many people talk about all of the items that I had planned to talk about in the fishbowl throughout the day. I think it's a great sign for what we're going to be able to accomplish in the state over the next year and longer. I am going to take us through a quick wrap up. I appreciate everyone sticking with us through this. I think it was a great day. And so without further ado, we will move into our end game here. Let's see if I can get this correct on sharing. And there we go. All right. So thanks again to everyone. I want to just run through a few of kind of the big comments from a few of our speakers. From Admiral Greenert this morning on diversifying our energy sources, improving national security, competition with China in the global marketplace. We heard about critical minerals, and these are extremely important. Moving forward, we heard from the American Lung Association, great presentation on the risks of unhealthy air. We know how much that has been an issue, magnified by the pandemic that we are dealing with. So we appreciate them. Sorry about that. And then Rudy really hit home on the equity issues. We can't talk about these separate. We need to build equity and talking and making real connections with the communities where we're all going to be working as we build out these plans. And we cannot emphasize that enough as making sure that we solve these transportation issues for everyone as we move towards electrification. Sorry about that. We heard from a great state panel. I want to thank everyone again from that panel. I think it was a thorough discussion of all of the issues that are going to be coming up in Nevada. And here are just a few of the big quotes from some of our colleagues on that. We heard from state legislators. It's great to see bipartisan support for electrification in these programs. We're going to need everyone in on this together in order to really solve this problem. And then, of course, the fireside chat. We got to hear from a lot of the industry players, and thank to everyone that came back for the fishbowl as well. Obviously, we're going to continue having all of these discussions. We heard from Chris on utility rate design, and then lastly, we heard from Hannah on some of the lessons learned from California. Really great stuff there. It's nice when someone else takes the risks and we can learn from that moving forward. And I think it's an important lesson learned there as we develop this market further in Nevada. So just a couple of quick next steps for those of you that stuck with us for this. We will be sending you a survey. We will be sharing the slides, which include those facts that you saw during some of the breaks from our friends at Atlas. They do some really great jobs with that. We'll be setting up a small listserv for very rare for not too many communication emails from us, but highlighting some of the big movements in electrification within the state. We will be continuing to work on the Nevada blueprint that I went over briefly before the fishbowl. We'll be reaching out to a lot of you for your input on that. We want this to be collaborative, and we really want to make sure that it encompasses all of the goals that we want to hit and we discussed today. And then we will continue to be engaged. Really great turnout today, and we thank everybody for that. And with that, if you need to reach out to the Electrification Coalition, please feel free to at any point. My contact information is there. I mean, most of you know how to reach me. But with that, I will say thank you once again to all the participants. Extra thank you to all of our speakers, including in the fishbowl. We hope you guys all really enjoyed this and learned something. We look forward to working with you going forward. And with that, I believe we will wrap. So thank you all so much and have a great evening.